This is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to real events or persons is purely coincidental. This story is purely fictional and does not promote or encourage any form of violence. She coaxed Arista to the communal fire pit. Brisbane Alley was literally the end of the road in Equesta, a wretched little dirt patch behind Brickton's tannery, where the stench from the curing hides kept away any except the most desperate. Newcomers without money, relatives, or connections settled here. The lucky ones lived huddled under canvas sheets, carts, and the wagons they'd arrived in. The rest simply huddled against the tannery wall, trying to block the wind as they slept. So had Arista, that is, until the Barkers adopted her. Bryce Barker worked shouting advertisements through the city streets for 7 coppers a day. All of that went to buy food to feed 3 children and his wife. Lynette Barker took in what sewing work she could find. When the weather turned colder, they had offered Arista a place under their wagon. She had known them for only a few weeks, but already she loved them like her own family. "Here, Ella," Lynette said, bringing an old kirtle for her to put on. The dress was little more than a rag, worn thin and frayed along the hem. Lynette also brought Ezra Hardin's robe. Arista went around the corner and slipped out of her wet things. Lynette's dress did nothing to keep out the cold, but the robe vanquished the wet chill instantly in uncompromising warmth. "That's really a wonderful robe, Ella," Lynette told her, marveling at how the firelight made it shimmer and reflect colors. "Where did you get it?" "A friend left it to me when he died." "Oh, I'm sorry," she said sadly. Her expression changed then from one of sadness to one of concern. "That reminds me, a man was looking for you." "A man?" Arista asked as she folded the tablecloth. If anything happened to it, Edith would make Ibis pay. "Yes, earlier today. He spoke to Bryce while he was working on the street and mentioned he was looking for a young woman. He described you perfectly. Although oddly enough, he didn't know your name." "What did he look like?" Arista hoped her concern was not reflected in her voice. "Well," Lynette faltered, "that's the thing. He wore a dark hood and a scarf wrapped about his face, so Bryce didn't get a good look at him." Arista pulled the robe tightly about her. "Is he here? Has the assassin managed to track me down?" Lynette noticed the change in her and asked, "Are you in trouble, Ella?" "Did Bryce tell him I lived here?" "No, of course not. Bryce does many things, but he's no fool." "Did he give a name?" Lynette shook her head. "You can ask Bryce about him when he returns. He and Weary went to buy flour. They should be back soon." "Speaking of that," Arista said, fishing coins out of her wet dress, "here's 3 copper tenants. They paid me this morning." "Oh no, we couldn't." "Of course you can. You let me sleep under your wagon and you watch my things when I'm at work. You even let me eat with you." "But 3? That's your whole pay, Ella. You won't have anything left." "I'll get by. They feed me at the palace sometimes, and my needs are pretty simple. But you'll want a new set of clothes, and you'll need shoes come winter. So will your children, and you won't be able to afford them without an extra 3 coppers a week." No, we can't. It's very nice of you, but..." Ma, come quick. It's Weary." Finis, the Barkers' eldest son, raced down the street, shouting as he came. He looked frightened, his eyes filled with tears. Lynette lifted her skirt and ran, Arista chasing after her. They rushed to Coswell Avenue, where a crowd formed outside the bakery. Pushing past the crowd, they saw a boy lying unconscious on the cobblestone. "Oh, sweet Maribor," Lynette cried, falling to her knees beside her son. Bryce knelt on the stone, holding Weary in his arms. Blood soaked his hands and tunic. The boy's eyes were closed, his matted hair slick as if dipped in red ink. He fell from the baker's loft. Finis answered their unasked question, his voice quavering. He was pulling one of them heavy flour bags down, 'cause the baker said he'd sell us 2 cups for the price of 1 if he did it. Pa and I told him to wait for us, but he ran up, like he's always doing. He was pulling real hard as he could, and then his hand slipped. He stumbled backward and... Finis was talking fast, his voice rising as he did, until it cracked and he stopped. Hit his head on the cobblestones, declared a stranger who wore a white apron and held a lantern. Arista thought he might be the baker. "I'm real sorry. I didn't think the boy would hurt himself like this." Lynette ignored the man and pried her child from her husband. Pulling Weary to her breast, she rocked him as if he were a newborn. "Wake up, honey," she whispered softly. Tears fell on Weary's blood-soaked cheeks. "Please, baby. Oh, for the love of Maribor, please wake up. Please, oh, please." "Lynn, honey," Bryce started. "No," she shouted at him and tightened her grip on the boy. Arista stared at the scene. Her throat was tight and her eyes were filling so quickly that she couldn't see clearly. Weary was a wonderful boy, playful, friendly. He reminded her of Fannin Pickering, which only made matters worse. But Fannin had died with a sword in his hand, and Weary was only 8 and likely had never touched a weapon in his short life. She couldn't understand why such things happened to good people. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she watched the small figure of the boy dying in his mother's arms. Arista closed her eyes, wiping the tears. When she opened them again, she noticed several people in the crowd backing away. Her robe was glowing, giving off a pale light. The shimmering material illuminated those around her with an eerie white radiance. Lynette saw the glow and hope flooded her face. She looked up at Arista, her eyes pleading. "Ella, can you save him?" she asked with trembling lips and desperate eyes. Arista began to form the word no, but Lynette quickly spoke again. "You can," she insisted. "I know you can. I've always known there was something different about you. The way you talk, the way you act, the way you forget your own name, and that robe. You can save him. I know you can. Oh, please, Ella." She paused and swallowed, shaking so hard it made Weary's head rock. "Oh, Ella, I know. I know it's so much more than 3 coppers. But he's my baby. You'll help him, won't you? Please, oh please, Ella." Arista couldn't breathe. She felt her heart pounding in her ears, and her body trembled. Everyone silently watched her. Even Lynette stopped her pleading. Arista found herself saying through quivering lips, "Lay him down." Lynette gently lowered Weary's body, his limbs lifeless, his head tilted awkwardly to one side. Blood continued to seep from the boy's wound. Arista knelt beside him and placed her hand on the boy's chest. He was still breathing, but it was so shallow, so weak. Closing her eyes, she began to hum. She heard the concerned mutterings of those in the crowd, and one by one, she tuned them out. Arista could sense the heartbeats of the men and women surrounding her, and she forced them out as well. She focused on the sound of the wind. Soft and gentle it blew, swirling between the buildings, across the street, skipping over stones. Above her, she felt the twinkle of the stars and the smile of the moon. Her hand was on the body of the boy, but her fingers felt the strings of the instrument she longed to play. The gentle wind grew stronger. The swirl became an eddy, the eddy a whirlwind, and the whirlwind a vortex. Her hair whipped madly, but she hardly noticed. Before her lay a void, and beyond that was a distant light. She could see him in the darkness, a dull silhouette before the brilliance, growing smaller as he traveled away. She shouted to him. He paused. She strummed the chords and the silhouette turned. Then with all her strength, she clapped her hands together and the sound was thunder. When she opened her eyes, the light from the robe had faded and the crowd was cheering. Chapter 10. Fallen Star. "Sail ho!" the lookout shouted from the masthead. The Emerald Storm was now 2 weeks out of Aquesta, slipping across the placid waters of the Gazelle Sea. The wind remained blowing from the southwest. Since rounding the Horn of Delgos, they made slow progress. The ship was close-heeled, struggling to gain headway into the wind. Mr. Temple kept the top crews busy, tacking the ship round, wearing windward, and keeping their course by crossing back and forth. But Hadrian guessed that a quickly walking man could make faster progress. It was mid-morning, and the seamen who were not in the rigging or otherwise engaged in the ship's navigation were busy scrubbing the deck with sandstone blocks or flogging it dry. All the midshipmen were on the quarterdeck, taking instruction in navigation from Lieutenant Bishop. Hadrian heard the lookout's call as he returned to the galley after delivering the previous evening's pork grease. Making his way to the port side, he spotted a small white square on the horizon. Bishop immediately suspended class and took an eyeglass to see for himself, then sent a midshipman to the captain's cabin. The captain emerged so quickly that he was still adjusting his hat as he appeared on the quarterdeck. He paused for a moment, tugged on his uniform, and sniffed the air with a wrinkle of his nose. "Lookout report," he called to the masthead. "2 ships off the port bow, sir." No. Hadrian looked again, and just as the lookout had reported, he spotted a second sail, now visible above the line of the water. The foremost is showing 2 squares, appears to be a lugger. The farther ship, I'm seeing 2 red lateen sails, single-decked, possibly a tartan. They're running with the wind and closing fast, sir. "What flag are they flying?" "Can't say, sir. The wind has them blowing straight at us." Hadrian watched the ships approach, amazed at their speed. Already he could see them clearly. "This could be trouble," Poe said. Hadrian had been so intent on the ships that he had failed to notice his assistant appear beside him. The thin rail of a boy was busy tying the black ribbon in his ponytail as he stared out at the vessels. "How's that?" "Those red sails." Hadrian looked back out across the water. "And why is that a problem?" "Only the Dakar use them, and they're worse than any pirates you'll run across." "Beat to quarters, Mr. Bishop," the captain ordered. "All hands on station," the lieutenant shouted. "Beat to quarters." Hadrian heard a drum roll as the bosun and his mates cleared the deck. The midshipmen, dispersed to their stations, shouted orders to their crews. "Come on," Poe told him. There was a pile of briquettes at the protected center of the forecastle. Hadrian ignited them with hot coals from the galley stove as soon as the surrounding deck had been soaked with seawater. Around it, archers prepped their arrows with oil. Seamen brought dozens of buckets of seawater, along with buckets of sand, and positioned them around the ship. It took only minutes to secure for battle, and then they waited. The ships were closer and larger now, but still the flags they flew were invisible. The storm remained deathly silent, the only sounds coming from the wind, the waves, and the creaking hull. A random gust fluttered the lugger's flag. "They're flying the Gribbon of Calais, sir," the lookout shouted. "Mr. Wesley," the captain addressed the midshipman stationed on the quarterdeck. "You've studied signals." "Aye, sir." "Take your glass and get aloft. Mr. Temple, run up our name and request theirs." Aye, sir." Still no one else moved or spoke. All eyes were on the approaching vessels. "Lead vessel is the Bright Star. Aft vessel is..." Wesley hesitated. "Aft vessel isn't responding, sir." 2 points a port," the captain shouted abruptly. And Wyatt spun the wheel, weathering the ship as close to the wind as possible, heading them directly towards the lugger. The top men went into action like 100 spiders, crawling along the shrouds, working to grab every bit of wind possible. "New signal from the Bright Star," Wesley shouted. "Hostile ship astern." Small streaks of smoke flew through the otherwise clear sky. The Tautan was firing arrows at the Bright Star. But the shots fell short, dropping into the sea a good 200 yards astern. "Ready the forward ballista," the captain ordered. A squad of men on the forecastle began to crank a small capstan, which ratcheted the massive bowstring into firing position. They lighted another brazier in advance of the stanchion as an incendiary bolt was loaded. Then they waited, once more watching the ship sail closer. Everything about the Dhaka ship was exotic, made of dark wood. The vessel glittered with gold swirls artfully painted along the hull. It bore long decorative pendants of garish colors. A stylized image of a black dragon in flight adorned the scarlet mainsail, and on the bowsprit was the head of a ghoulish beast with bright emerald eyes. The sailors appeared as foreign as the ship. They were dark-skinned, powerful brutes, wearing only bits of red cloth wrapped around their waists. Poorly handled, the Bright Star lost the wind and its momentum. Behind it, the Tautan descended. Another volley of arrows from the Dhaka smoked through the air. This time several struck the Bright Star in the stern, but one lucky shot made it to the mainsail, setting it aflame. Although victorious over the lugger, the Tautan chose to flee before the approaching emerald storm. It came about, and Hadrian watched Captain Seward ticking off the distance as the storm inched toward it. Even after the time lost during the turn, the Deki ship was still out of ballista range. "Hell, Molly! Bring her over!" the captain shouted. "Tacks and sheets!" The Emerald Storm swung round to the same tack as the Tautan. But the storm did not have the momentum under it, nor the nimbleness of the smaller ship. The Tautan was the faster vessel, and all the crew of the Emerald Storm could do was watch as the Dhaka sailed out of reach. Seeing the opportunity lost, Captain Seward ordered the storm heaved to and the long boats launched. The Bright Star's mainsail and mast burned like a giant torch. Stays and braces snapped, and the screams of men announced the fall of the flaming canvas to the deck. Still, the ship's momentum carried it astern of the storm. As it passed, they could see the terrified sailors struggling hopelessly to put out the flames that enveloped the deck. Before the longboats were in the water, the Bright Star was an inferno, and most of the crew were already in the sea. The boats returned laden with frantic men. Nearly all were tawny-skinned, dark-eyed sailors dressed in whites and grays. They lay across the deck, coughing, spitting water, and thanking Maribor, as well as any nearby crew member. The Bright Star was an independent West Burden trader from Dagestan, heading home to western Calais with a load of coffee, cane, and indigo. Despite the storm's timely intervention, more than a third of the crew perished. Some passed out in the smoke while fighting the flames. The others remained trapped below deck. The captain of the Bright Star perished, struck by one of the fiery arrows the Dhaka had rained on his vessel. This left only 12 men, 5 of whom lay in Dr. Levy's care with burns. Mr. Temple sized up the able-bodied survivors and added them to the ship's complement. Royce was back at work aloft as Hadrian finished serving dinner to the crew. Hadrian's easygoing attitude and generosity with the galley grease had won him several friends. There'd been no more attempts on Royce's life, but they still didn't know why Royce had been targeted or by whom. For the moment it was enough that Bernie, Durning, and Stoll remained at a safe distance. "Aye, this is Calais, not Avron," Hadrian heard one of the new seamen say in a harsh, gravelly voice as he brought down the last mess kid. "The light of civilization grows weak like a candle in a high easterly wind. The farther east you go, the stronger the wind blows, till out she goes, and in the darkness ye stand." A large number of the off-watch clustered around a aft table where 3 of the new sailors sat. "Then there you are in the world of the savage," the Kalayan sailor went on. "A strange place, my lads, a strange place indeed. Harsh, violent seas and jagged inlets of black-toothed rock gripped tight by dense jungle. The netherworld of the Baran Gazelle, the heart of darkness, is a place of misery and despair, the prison where Novron drove the beasties to their eternal punishment. They can't help but try to get out. They look at the coasts of Calais with hungry eyes, and they find footholds. Like lichen, they slip in and grow everywhere, and the Kalayans try to push them back. But it'd be like trying to swat a sky of flies or hold water in your hands." He cupped his palms, pretending to lose something between his fingers. "Goblin and man living so close together ain't natural," another said. The first sailor nodded gravely. "But nothing in them jungles be natural. They have been linked for too long. The sons of Maribor and the spawn of Uberland be warring one moment, then trading the next. Just to survive, the Kalayan warlords took to the ways of the goblins and spread the cursed practices of the Sparan to their own kin. Some of them are more goblin now than men. They even worship the dark god, burning Tulan leaves and making sacrifices. They live like beasts. At night the moon makes them wild, and in the darkness their eyes glow red." Several of the men made sounds of disbelief. "It's the truth, my lads. Centuries ago, when the old empire fell, the eastern lords were abandoned to their fate. Left alone in the deep dark of the Kalayan jungles, they lost their humanity. Now the great stone fortresses along the Goblin Sea that once guarded the land from invasion be the home of Tenkin warlords, half human, half goblin monsters. They've turned their backs on the face of Maribor and embraced the ways of the Gazelle. Aye, me fellows, the state of Calais is a fearful one. So thankful we be for your daring act of kindness, for we'd be at the mercy of fate if you hadn't pulled us from the sea. If it wasn't for your bravery, we'd surely be dead now, or worse." "Wasn't much bravery needed," Daniel said. "The storm could have whipped those buggers in a dead calm with half the crew drunk and the other half sick with a fever." "Is that what you think?" Wyatt asked. Hadrian hadn't noticed him sitting silently in the gloom beyond the circle of the candle's light. "Is that what you all think?" His tone was oddly harsh, challenging. Wyatt sighed, and with an exasperated shake of his head, got up and climbed the ladder to the deck. Having finished with the mess kids, Hadrian followed. He found the helmsman on the forecastle, his hands gripped on the rail as he stared at the shimmer of the new moon rolling on the back of the Black Sea. "What's that all about?" "We're in trouble, and—" He paused, angrily motioning at the quarterdeck. Catching himself, he clenched his teeth as if by doing so he could trap the words inside his mouth. "What kind of trouble?" Hadrian glanced at the quarterdeck. "The captain doesn't want me to say anything. He's a damn fool who won't listen to reason. I should disobey him and alter the ship's course right now. I could relieve Blyden on the wheel early and take us off course. No one would know until the reckoning is taken tomorrow at noon. Wesley would know." Hadrian pointed to the young man climbing to the quarterdeck on his nightly round as officer of the first watch. "He'd have you hauled to Mr. Bishop before you could blink. I could deal with Wesley if I had to. The deck is slippery, you know." "Now you're starting to sound like Royce. What's going on?" I suppose if I'm contemplating killing a midshipman, it hardly matters if I break captain's orders to keep quiet." Wyatt looked once again at the sea. "They're coming back." "Who?" "The Darker. They didn't run. They're regrouping." He looked at Hadrian. "They dye their sails with the blood of their enemies. Did you know that? Hundreds of small, ruddy boats line the coves and ports of their island. They know we're hugging the coast and sailing against the wind. Like wolves, they'll chase us down. 10, 20. Latin-rigged tartans will catch the wind that we can't. The storm won't stand a chance." "What makes you so sure? It could be wrong. The captain must have a good reason to stay on course." "I'm not wrong." Chapter 11. The Hooded Man. The hooded man walked away again. Arista cowered deeper into the shadows under the tavern steps. She wanted to disappear, to become invisible. Her robe had turned a dingy brown, blending with the dirty wood. Drawing up the hood, she waited. It was him, the same man Lynette had described. He was looking for her. She heard the sound of his boots on the cobblestone. They slowed, hesitated, and then grew louder. "He's coming back again!" The tall, dark figure appeared at the end of the alley for the third time. He paused. She held her breath. The street lamps revealed a frightening figure dressed in a black hooded cloak and a thick scarf hiding his face. He wore an unseen sword. She could hear the telltale clap. He took a tentative step toward her hiding place, then another, and then paused. The light's glare exposed white puffs issuing from his scarf. His head turned from side to side. He stood for several seconds, then pivoted so sharply his boot heel dug a tiny impression in the gravel and walked away. After several tense minutes, Arista carefully crept out. He was gone. The first light of dawn rose in the east. If only she could make it back to the palace. At least there she would be safe from the assassin and away from the inevitable questions. Who is she? How did she do it? Is she a witch? She had left Brisbane Alley before anyone thought to ask. But what about after? She had drawn too much attention, and although she doubted anyone would connect the dots, the unabashed use of magic would cause a stir. She removed the robe, carefully tucked it under the tavern steps, and set off toward the palace. The guards ignored her as usual, and she went about her tasks without incident. Throughout the day, she had the good fortune to work relatively unnoticed, but by midday news of the events of the night before had reached the palace. Everyone buzzed about the disturbance on Coswall Avenue. A boy had been brought back to life. By evening, rumors named the Witch of Melangar as the culprit. Luckily, no one suspected the scrub girl, Ella, of any more wrongdoing than failing to return the borrowed tablecloth. Arista was exhausted, and not merely from losing a night's sleep while avoiding the assassin. Saving Weary had drained her. After the day's work was over, she returned to the alley and retrieved the wizard's robe. She didn't dare put it on for fear someone might recognize it. Rolling it up and clutching it to her chest, she made her way to the edge of the broad avenue, unable to decide what to do next. Staying would be sheer stupidity. Looking down the broad length of Grand Avenue, she could see the front gates of the city. It felt like a lifetime since she had been home, and it would be so good to see a familiar face, to hear her brother's voice, to rest. She knew she should leave. She should go that very minute. But she was so tired. The idea of setting out into the cold, dark, alone and hungry, was too much to bear. She desperately needed a safe place to sleep, a hot meal and a friendly face, which meant just one thing: the Barkers. Besides, she couldn't leave without retrieving her pearl-handled hairbrush. the last remaining keepsake from her father. Nothing had changed at the end of Brisbane Alley. The length was still dotted with small campfires and littered with the bulky shadows of makeshift tents, carts, wagons, and barrels. People moved about in the growing dark, Some glanced at her as she passed, but no one spoke or approached her. She found the Barkers' wagon, and as always, a great tarp stretched out from it like a porch awning. One of the boys spotted her, and a moment later, Lynette rushed out. Without a word, she threw her arms around Arista and squeezed tightly. "Come, have something to eat," she said, wiping her cheeks and leading Arista by the hand. Lynette laid a pot on the fire. "I saved some just in case. I had to hide it, of course, or the vultures would have gobbled it all down. I wasn't sure you'd be back." The rest of the Barkers gathered around the fire. Finis and Hengist sat on the far side. Bryce Barker, dressed in his usual white shirt and gray trousers, sat on an upturned crate whittling a bit of wood. No one spoke. Arista took a seat on a wooden box, feeling awkward. Is that apprehension in their eyes, or outright fear? "Ella," Lynette finally asked in a small, tentative voice, "who are you?" "I can't tell you that," she said after a long pause. She expected them to complain or press further. Instead, they all nodded silently, as if they had expected her answer, just as she had expected their question. "I don't care who you are. You're always welcome at this fire," Bryce said. He kept his eyes on the flames, but his words betrayed an emotion she had not expected. Bryce, who made his living shouting in the streets all day, hardly ever spoke. Lynette dished out the bit of stew she had warmed up. "I wish there was more. If I had only known you'd be back." "How is Weary?" Arista asked. He slept all night, but was up most of the day running around, causing a nuisance as usual. Everyone who's seen him is saying the same thing. It was a miracle. "Everyone?" Arista asked with concern. "Folks been stopping by all day to see him and asking about you. Many said they had sick children or loved ones who were dying. One got so angry he knocked down the canvas and nearly upset the wagon before Finis brought Bryce home to clear him out." "I'm sorry." "Oh, don't be. Please. No, don't ever be sorry," Lynette pleaded. She paused, her eyes tearing again. "You won't be able to stay with us anymore, will you?" Arista shook her head. "The hooded man. And others." "I wish I could help," Lynette said. Arista leaned over and hugged her. "You have. More than you'll ever know. If I could just get a good night's sleep, then I—" "Of course you can. Sleep in the wagon. It's the least we can do." Arista was too exhausted to argue. She climbed up and, in the privacy of the cart, put the robe on to fight away the night's cold. She crawled across a lumpy bedding of coarse cloth that smelled of potatoes and onions, and laid her head down at last. It felt so good to close her eyes and let her muscles and mind go. She could hear them whispering outside, trying not to disturb her. "She's a servant of Maribor," one of the boys said. She couldn't tell which. "That's why she can't say. The gods never let them say." "Or she could be Kyle, a god disguised and doing good deeds," the other added. "I heard he gets feathers from Uriel's cloak for each one he does." "Hush, he'll hear you," Lynette scolded. "Go clean that pot." Arista fell asleep to their whispers and woke to loud voices. "I told you, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know anything about a witch." It was Bryce's voice, and he sounded frightened. Arista peered out from the wagon. An Imperial soldier stood holding a torch, his way blocked by Bryce. Behind him, farther up the alley, Other soldiers pounded on the door to the tannery and forced their way into the other tents. "Sergeant!" the man in front of Bryce called. "Over here!" 3 soldiers walked fast, their armor jangling, hard boots hammering the cobblestone. "Tear down this hovel and search it," the sergeant ordered. "Continue to do the same for all these places. They're an eyesore and should be removed anyway." "Leave them alone," Arista said, stepping out of the wagon. "They haven't done anything." "Ella," Bryce snapped, "stay out of this." The sergeant moved briskly toward Arista, but Bryce stepped in the way. "Leave my daughter alone," he threatened. "Bryce, no," Arista whispered. "I'm only here for the witch," the soldier told them. "But if you insist, I'll be happy to torch every tent in this alley." "She's no witch," Lynette cried, clutching Weary to her side. "She saved my baby. She's a servant of Maribor." The sergeant studied Arista briefly, sucking on his front teeth. "Bind her," he ordered. 2 of his men stepped forward with a length of rope and grabbed hold of Arista by her arms. They immediately cried out in pain, let go, and stumbled backward. Ezra Hardan's robe glowed a deep, pulsating red. The guards glared at her in fear, shaking their injured hands. Seeing her chance, Arista closed her eyes and began to concentrate. She focused on blocking out the sounds of the street and on. Pain exploded across her face. She fell backward to the ground where she lay dazed, her eyesight darkened at the edges. A ringing wailed in her ears. "We'll have none of that," the sergeant declared. She looked up through watery eyes, seeing him standing over her, rubbing his knuckles. He drew his sword and pointed it at Bryce. "I know better than to let you cast your spells, witch. Don't make another sound. And remove that robe. Do it now. I'll strip you naked if needed. Make no sudden moves or sounds, or I'll cleave off this man's head here and now." Lynette was somewhere to her right, and Arista heard her gasp in horror. "The robe! Take it off!" Arista wiggled out of the robe, leaving herself clothed in only Lynette's thin kirtle. The sergeant sucked on his teeth again and stepped closer. "Are my men going to have any more trouble with you?" He lifted the point of his sword toward Bryce once again. Arista shook her head. "Good. Bind her tightly, wrap her wrists and fingers, and find something to gag her with." The guards approached again and jerked her arms so roughly behind her back that she cried out. "Please, don't hurt her," Lynette begged. "She didn't do anything wrong." They tied her wrists, wrapping the rope around her fingers, pulling until the skin pinched painfully. As they did, the sergeant ordered Lynette to pick up the robe and hand it to him. One of the soldiers grabbed Arista by the hair, dragging her to her feet. Another took hold of one of her sleeves and ripped it off. "Open your mouth," he ordered, pulling Arista's head back. When she hesitated, the soldier slapped her across the face. Again, she staggered and might have fallen if not for the other guard still holding her hair. The slap was not nearly as painful as the blow the sergeant had given, but it made her eyes water again. "Now open." He stuffed the material into her mouth, jamming it in so far Arista thought she would choke. He tied it in place by wrapping more rope around her head and wedging it between her lips. When they tied one final length around her neck, Arista feared they might hang her right there. "Now, that should keep us safe," declared the sergeant. "We'll cut those hands off when we get to the palace, and after you've answered questions, I expect we'll take that tongue as well." A crowd gathered as they dragged her away, and Arista could hear Lynette weeping. As they reached Coswall, the patrons of the Bailey turned out to watch. The men stood on the porch, holding mugs. She heard the word witch muttered more than once as she passed by. By the time they reached the square, she was out of breath and choking on the gag. When she lagged behind, the guard holding the leash jerked hard, and she fell. Her left knee struck the cobblestone of Bingham Square, and she screamed, but the sound came out as a muffled grunt. Twisting, she landed on her shoulder to avoid hitting her face. Lying on her side, Arista cried in agony from the pain shooting up her leg. "Up," the soldier ordered. The rope tightened on her throat, the rough cord cutting her skin. The guard growled, "Get up, you lazy ass." He pulled harder, dragging her a few inches across the stones. The rope constricted. She heard the pounding of blood in her ears. "Up, damn you!" She felt the rope cut into her neck. She could barely breathe. The pounding in her ears hammered like drums, pressure building. "Bruce," one of the guards called. "Get her up." "I'm trying." Debussy. There was another tug, and Arista managed to sit up. But she was lightheaded now. The street tilted and wobbled. As darkness grew at the edges of her vision, it was becoming difficult to see. She tried to tell them she was choking. All that came out was a pitiful moan. She struggled to reach her knees, but the dizziness worsened. The ground shifted and dipped. She fell, hitting her shoulder again, and rolled to her back. She looked up at the soldier holding the leash and pleaded with her eyes, but all she saw in reply was anger and disgust. "Get up, or—" He stopped. The soldier looked abruptly to his right. He appeared puzzled. He let go of the rope and took a step backward. The cord loosened, the pounding eased, and she could breathe again. She lay in the street, her eyes closed, happy to be alive. The clang of metal and the scuffle of feet caught her attention. Arista looked up to see the would-be strangler collapse on the street beside her. Standing an arm's length away, the hooded man loomed with a blood-coated sword. From his belt he drew a dagger and threw it. Somewhere behind her there was a grunt, and then a sound like a sack of flour hitting the ground. The hooded man bolted past her. She heard a cry of pain. Metal struck metal, then another grunt. This one followed by a gurgling voice speaking garbled words. Another clash, another cry. She twisted around, rolling to her knees. She found him again. He stood in the center of Bingham Square, holding his sword in one hand and a dagger in the other. 3 bodies lay on the ground. 2 soldiers remained. "Who are you?" the sergeant shouted at him. "We are Imperial soldiers acting on official orders." The hooded man said nothing. He rushed forward, swinging his blade. He dodged to the right, and catching the sergeant's sword high, he stabbed the man in the neck with his dagger. As he did, the remaining soldier swung at him. The hooded man cried out, then whirled in rage. He charged the last soldier, striking at him, his overwhelming fury driving the guard back. The soldier turned and ran. The hooded man gave chase. The guard nearly made it to the end of the street before he was cleaved in the back. Once the soldier collapsed, the man continued attacking his screaming victim, stabbing him until he fell silent. Arista sat helpless, bound in the middle of the square as the hooded man turned. With his sword and cloak dripping blood, he came for her. He pulled Arista to her feet and into a narrow alley. He was breathing hard, sucking wetly through the scarf. No longer having the strength, physical or mental, Arista did not resist. The world was spinning, and the night slipped into the unreal. She didn't know what was happening or why, and she gave up trying to understand. He dragged her into a stable and pushed her against the rough-hewn wall. A pair of horses shifted fearfully, spooked by the smell of blood. He held her tightly and brought his knife to her throat. Arista closed her eyes and held her breath. She felt the cold steel pressed against her skin as he drew it, cutting the cord away. He spun her around, cut her wrists loose, and then the cord holding the gag fell free. "Follow me quickly," he whispered, pulling her along by the hand. Confused, She staggered after him. Something was familiar in that voice. He led her through a dizzying array of alleys, around dark buildings, and over wooden fences. Soon she had no idea where they were. He paused in a darkened corner, holding a finger to his scarf-covered lips. They waited briefly, then moved on. The wind picked up, carrying an odor of fish, and Arista heard the sound of surf. Ahead she could see the naked masts of ships bobbing at anchor along the wharf. When she reached a particularly dilapidated building, he led her up a back stair into a small room and closed the door behind them. She stood rigid near the door, watching him as he started a fire in an iron stove. Seeing his hands, his arms, and the tilt of his head, something was so familiar. With the fire stoked, he turned and took a step toward her. Arista shrank until her back was against the door. He hesitated and then nodded. She recognized something in his eyes. Reaching up, she drew back his hood and unwrapped the scarf. The face before her was painful to look at. Deformed and horribly scarred, it appeared to have melted into a patchwork of red blotches. One ear was missing, along with his eyebrows and much of his hair. His mouth lacked the pale pink of lips. His appearance was both horrid and so welcome, she could find no words to express herself. She broke into tears of joy and threw her arms around him, hugging as tightly as her strength allowed. "I hope this will teach you not to run off without me, Your Highness," Hilfrid told her. She continued to cry and squeeze, her head buried in his chest. Slowly, his arms crept up, returning her embrace. She looked up and he brushed strands of tear-soaked hair from her face. In more than a decade as her protector, he had never touched her so intimately. As if realizing this, Hilfrid straightened up and gently escorted her to a chair, before reaching for his scarf. "You're not going back out?" she asked fearfully. "No," he replied. His voice dropped a tone. "The city will be filled with guards. It won't be safe for either of us to venture in public for some time. We'll be all right here. There are no occupied buildings around, and I rented this flat from a blind man." "Then why are you covering up?" He paused a moment, looking at the scarf. "The sight of my face, it makes people uncomfortable, and it's important that you feel safe and at ease. That's my job. Remember. And you do it very well, but your face doesn't make me uncomfortable." "You don't find me unpleasant to look at?" Arista smiled warmly. "Hilfrid, your face is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The flat Hilfrid stayed in was very small, just a single room and a closet. The floor and walls were rough pine planks, weathered gray and scuffed smooth from wear. There were a rickety table, 3 chairs, and a ship's hammock. The single window was hazy from the buildup of ocean salt, admitting only a muted gray light. Hilfrid refused to burn a single candle after dark, for fear of attracting attention. The small stove kept the drafty shack tolerably warm at night, but before dawn, it was extinguished to avoid the chance of someone seeing the smoke. For 2 days they stayed in the shack, listening to the wind buffet the roof shingles and howl over the stovepipe. Hilfrid made soup from clams and fish he bought from the old blind man. Other than that, neither of them left the little room. Arista slept a lot. It seemed like years since she had felt safe and her body surrendered to exhaustion. Hilfrid kept her covered and crept around the flat, cursing to himself whenever he made a noise. On the night of the second day, she woke when he dropped a spoon. He looked at her sheepishly and cringed at the sight of her open eyes. "Sorry, I was just warming up some soup. I thought you might be hungry." "Thank you," she told him. "Thank you. Yes, isn't that what you say when someone does something for you?" He raised what would have been his eyebrows. "I've been your servant for more than 10 years, and you've never once said thank you." It was the truth, and it hurt her to hear it. What a monster she had been. Well overdue then, don't you think? Let me check your bandage. After you eat, Your Highness. She looked at him and smiled. "I've missed you so," she said. Surprise crossed his face. "You know, there were times growing up that I hated you. Mostly after the fire, for not saving my mother. But later I hated you the way you always followed me. I knew you reported my every move. It's a terrible thing for a teenage girl to have an older boy silently follow her every step. Watching her eat, watching her sleep, knowing her most intimate secrets. You were always silent, always watchful. Did you know I had a crush on you when I was 14? No, he said curtly. You were what? A dashing 17. I tried everything to make you jealous. I chased after all the squires at court, pretending they wanted me, but none of them did. And you were such the loathingly perfect gentleman. You stood by stoically, and it infuriated me. I would go to bed humiliated knowing that you were standing just outside of the door. When I was older, I treated you like furniture. Still, you treated me as you always had. During the trial, she noticed Hilfred flinch and decided not to finish the thought. And afterward, I thought you believed what they said and hated me. Hilfred put down the spoon and sighed. What? She asked, suddenly fearful. He shook his head and a small, sad laugh escaped his lips. It's nothing, Your Highness. Hilfred, call me Arista. He raised his brow once more. I can't. You're my princess and I'm your servant. That's how it's always been. But Hilfred, you've known me since I was 10. You followed me day and night. You've seen me early in the morning. You've seen me drenched in sweat from fevers. I think you can call me by my first name. He looked almost frightened and resumed stirring the pot. Hilfred? I'm sorry, Your Highness. I cannot call you by your given name. What if I command you to? Do you? No. Arista sighed. What is it with men who won't use my name? Hilfred glanced at her. I only knew him briefly, she explained, not knowing why. She'd never spoken about Emery to anyone before. I've lived so much of my life alone. It never used to bother me, and there's never been anyone until recently. Hilfred looked down and stirred the soup. He was killed. Since then, I felt this hole. The other night I was so scared. I thought, no, I was certain I was going to my death. I lost hope and then you appeared. I could really use a friend. And if you called me by... I can't be your friend, Your Highness, Hilfred told her coldly. Why not? There was a long pause. I can't tell you that. A loud silence filled the room. Arista stood clutching the blanket around her shoulders. She stared at Hilfred's back until it seemed her stare caused him to turn and face her. When he did, he avoided looking in her eyes. He set out bowls on the table. She stood before him, blocking his way. Hilfred, look at me. The soup is done. I'm not hungry. Look at me. I don't want it to burn. Hilfred? He said nothing and kept his eyes focused on the door. What have you done that you can't face me? He did not answer. The realization dawned on her and devastated Arista. He wasn't there to save her. He wasn't her friend. The betrayal was almost too much to bear. It's true. Her voice quavered. You do believe the stories they say about me. That I'm a witch, that I'm evil, that I killed my father over my lust for the throne. Are you working for Saldor or someone else? Did you steal me from the palace guards for some political advantage? Or is this all some plan to control me? To get me to trust you and lure me into revealing something? Her words had a profound effect on him. He looked pained, as if rained on by blows. His face was strained, his jaw stiff. "You could at least tell me the truth," she said. "I should think you owe that much to my father, if not to me. He trusted you. He picked you to be my bodyguard. He gave you a chance to make something of yourself. You've enjoyed the privilege of court life because of his faith in you." Hilfred was having trouble breathing. He turned away from her and, grabbing his scarf, moved toward the door. "Yes, go on," she shouted. "Tell them it didn't work. Tell them I didn't fall for it. Tell Solly and the rest of those bastards that I'm not the stupid little girl they thought I was. You should have kept me tied and gagged, Hilfred. You're going to find it harder to haul me off to the stake than you think." Hilfred slammed his hand against the doorframe, making Arista jump. He spun on her, his eyes fierce and wild in a way she had never seen before, and she stepped back. "Do you know why I saved you?" he shouted, his voice broken and shaking. Do you? To hand me over and get—" No, not now. Back then," he cried, waving his arm. "Years ago, when the castle was burning. Do you know why I saved you back then?" She didn't speak. She didn't move. "I wasn't the only one there, you know. There were others, soldiers, priests, servants. They all just stood watching. They knew you were inside, but not a single person did anything. They just watched the place burn. Bishop Saldor saw me running for the castle and actually ordered me to stop. He said it was too late, that I would die. I believed him. I truly did. But I went in anyway. Do you know why? Do you?" he shouted at her. She shook her head. "Because I didn't care. I didn't want to live. Not if you died." Tears streamed down his scarred face. "But don't ask me to be your friend. That is far too cruel a torture. As long as I can maintain a safe distance, as long as there is a wall between us, even if it's only one of words, I can tolerate. I can bear it." Hilfred wiped his eyes with his scarf. "Your father knew what he was doing. Oh yes, he knew exactly what he was doing when he appointed me to be your bodyguard. I would die 1,000 times over to protect you. But don't ask me to be grateful to him for the life he's given me. For it's been one of pain. I wish I had died that night, so many years ago. Or at least in Dahlgren, then it would be over. I wouldn't have to look at you. I wouldn't have to wake up every day wishing I'd been born the son of a great knight, or you the daughter of a poor shepherd." He covered his eyes and leaned his head against the threshold. Arista did not recall doing it, but somehow she had crossed the room. She took Hilfred's face in her hands, and rising up on her toes, she kissed his mouth. He didn't move, but he trembled. He didn't breathe, but he gasped. "Look at me," she said, extending her arms to display her stained and torn kirtle. "A shepherd's daughter would pity me, don't you think?" She took his hand and kissed it. "Can you ever forgive me?" He looked at her, confused. For what? For being so blind. Chapter 12. Sea Wolves. As it had for days, the Emerald Storm remained on its easterly course, making slow progress against a headwind that refused to shift. Maintaining direction required frequent tacking, which caused the top crews to work all night. Royce, as usual, had drawn the late shift. Getting this assignment was not Dime's fault. Royce had concluded that the mainmast captain was a fair man, but Royce was the newest member of a crew that rewarded seniority. He didn't mind the shift. He enjoyed the nights he spent aloft. The air was fresh, and in the dark among the ropes, he was comfortable as a spider in its web. This afforded Royce the opportunity to relax, think, and occasionally amuse himself by tormenting Bernie, who panicked any time his old guildmate lost track of Royce. Royce hung in the netting of the inaudible shroud, his feet dangling over the open space. A drop of nearly 100 feet. Above lay the dust of stars, while on the horizon, the moon rose as a sliver, a cat's eye, peering across the water at him. Below, lanterns flickered on the bow, quarterdeck, and stern, outlining the emerald storm. To his left, he could just make out the dark coast of Calais. Its thick vegetation was occasionally punctuated by a cliff or a brilliant white plume of a waterfall catching moonlight. The seasickness was gone. He couldn't recall a more miserable time than his first week on board. The nausea and dizziness reminded him of being drunk, a sensation he hated. He had spent most of the first night hugging the ship's figurehead and vomiting off the bow. After 4 days, his stomach had settled, but he remained drained, and he tired easily. It had taken weeks to dull the memory of that misery, but nested in the rigging, looking out at the dark sea, he forgot it all. It surprised him just how beautiful the black waves could be. The graceful, undulating swells kissed by the bare-faced moon all below a scattering of stars. Only one sight could surpass it. What's she doing right now? Is she looking at the same moon and thinking of me? Royce reached inside his tunic, pulled out the scarf and rubbed the material between his fingers. He held it to his face and breathed deep. It smelled like her. He kept it hidden, his tiny treasure soft and warm. On the nights of his sickness, he had lain in the hammock, clutching it to his cheek, as if it were a magic talisman to ward off misery. Only because of it had he been able to fall asleep. The officer's deck hatch opened, and Royce spotted Beryl stepping out into the night air. Beryl liked his sleep, and being senior midshipman, rarely held the late watch. He stood glancing around, taking in the lay of the deck. He cast an eye up at the main top, but Royce knew he was invisible in the dark tangles. Beryl spotted Wesley making his rounds on the forecastle and crossed the waist and headed up the stair. Wesley looked concerned at his approach but held his ground. Perhaps the boy would get another beating that night. Whatever torments Beryl had planned for Wesley were no concern of Royce's, and he thought it might be time to scare Bernie again. "I won't do it," Wesley declared, drawing Royce's attention. Once more, Beryl nervously looked upward. "Who are you looking for, Mr. Beryl?" Royce unhooked himself from the shrouds and rolled over for his own glance upward. As usual, Bernie was keeping his distance, no threat there. Royce climbed to the yard, walked to the end, and just as he had done during the race with Durning, slid down the rope so he could hear them. "I can make life on this ship very difficult for you," Beryl said, threatening Wesley. "Or have you forgotten your 2 days without sleep? There is talk that I'll be made acting lieutenant, and if you think your life is hard with my current rank, after my promotion it'll be a nightmare, and I'll see to it that any transfer is refused." "I don't understand." "You don't have to. In fact, it's better if you don't. That way you can sound sincere if the captain questions you. Just find him guilty of something. Misconduct, disrespect. I don't care. You put his buddy, the cook, on report for not saluting. Do something like that. Only this time, it needs to be a flogging offense." "But why me? Why can't you invent this charge?" "Because if the accusation comes from you, the captain or Mr. Bishop will not question it." He grinned. "And if they do, it's your ass, not mine." "And that's supposed to entice me?" "No, but I'll get off your back. And if you don't, you won't eat, you won't sleep, and you'll become very accident-prone. The sea can be dangerous. Midshipman Jenkins lost both thumbs on our last voyage when he slipped with a rope. Which is strange, cause he didn't handle ropes that day. Invent a charge, make it stick and get him flogged. And why do you want him whipped? I told you my friends want blood. Now, do we have a deal? Wesley stared at Beryl and took a deep breath. I can't misrepresent a man, and certainly not one under my command, simply to avoid personal discomfort. It'll be a great deal more than discomfort, you little git. The best I can do is to forget that we had this conversation. Of course, should some unusual or circumstantial accusation be leveled against Seaman Melbourne, I might find it necessary to report this incident to the captain. I suspect he will take a dim view of your efforts to advance insubordination on this vessel. It could be viewed as the seeds of mutiny, and we both know the penalty for that. You don't know who you're playing with, boy. As much as you like to think it, you're no Brecton. If I can't use you, I lose you. Is that all, Mr. Beryl? I must tack the ship now. Beryl spat at the younger man's feet and stalked away. Wesley remained standing rigidly, watching him go. Once Beryl had disappeared below, Wesley gripped the rail and took off his hat to wipe the sweat from his forehead. He took a deep breath, replaced his hat, straightened his jacket, and then shouted in a clear voice, "Hands to the braces!" Royce had dealt with many people in his life, from serfs to kings, and few surprised him. He knew he could always depend on their greed and weakness, and he was rarely disappointed. Wesley was the first person in years to astonish him. While the young midshipman could not see it, Royce offered him the only sincere salute he had bestowed since he had stepped aboard. Royce ascended to the topsail to loose the yard brace in anticipation of Wesley's next order, when his eye caught an irregularity on the horizon. At night, with only the suggestion of a moon, it was hard for anyone to tell where the sky ended and the sea began. Royce, however, could discern the difference. At that moment, he noticed a break in the line. Out to sea, ahead of the storm, a black silhouette broke the dusty star field. "Sail ho!" he shouted. "What was that?" Wesley asked. "Sail off the starboard bow!" he shouted, pointing to the northeast. "Is there a light?" "No, sir. A triangle-shaped sail." Wesley moved to the starboard rail. "I don't see anything. How far out?" "On the horizon, sir." The horizon? Wesley picked up the eyeglass and panned the sea. The rest of the ship was silent, except for the creaking of the oak timbers as they waited. Wesley muttered something as he slapped the glass closed and ran to the quarterdeck to pound on the captain's cabin. He paused and then pounded again. The door opened to reveal the captain, barefoot, in his nightshirt. "Mr. Wesley, have we run aground? Is there a mutiny?" The captain's steward rushed to him with his robe. "No, sir. There's a sail on the horizon, sir." "A what?" "A triangular sail, sir. Over there." Wesley pointed while handing him the glass. "On the horizon, you say? But how?" Seward crossed to the rail and looked out. "By ma, you've got keen eyes, lad." "Actually, the maintop crew spotted it first. Sounded like Seaman Melbourne, sir." "I'll be buggered. Looks like 3 ships, Mr. Wesley. Call all hands." Aye, sir." Wesley roused Bristol, who woke the rest of the crew. In a matter of minutes, men ran to their stations. Lieutenant Bishop was still buttoning his coat when he reached the quarterdeck, followed by Mr. Temple. "What is it, sir?" "The Dhaka have returned." Wyatt, who was taking the helm, glanced over. "Orders, sir?" he asked coldly. "Watch your tone, helmsman," Temple snapped. "Just asking, sir." "Asking for a caning," Mr. Temple roared, "and you'll get one if you don't keep a civil tongue." "Shut up, both of you. I need to think." Seward began to pace the quarterdeck, his head down. One hand played with the tie to his robe. The other stroked his lips. "Sir, we only have one chance, and it's a thin one at that," Wyatt said. Mr. Temple took hold of his cane and moved toward him. "Belay, Mr. Temple," the captain ordered before turning his attention back to Wyatt. "Explain yourself, helmsman. At that range with the land behind us, the Daka can't possibly see the storm. All they can see are the lanterns." "Good God, you're right. Put out those—" "No, wait, sir." Wyatt stopped. "We want them to see the lanterns. Lower the longboat, rig it with a pole fore and aft, and hang 2 lanterns on the ends. Put ours out as you light those, then cast off. The Daka will focus on it all night. We'll be able to bring the storm about, catch the wind, and reach the safety of West Bardan Bay. But that's not our destination. Damn our orders, sir. If we don't catch the wind, the Daka will be on us by tomorrow night." "I'm the captain of this ship," Seward roared. "Another outburst, and I'll not hold Mr. Temple's hand." The captain looked at the waiting crew. Every eye was on him. He returned to pacing with his head down. "Sir?" Bishop inquired. "Orders?" "Can't you see I'm thinking, man?" "Yes, sir." The wind fluttered the sails overhead as the ship began to lose the angle on the wind. "Lower the longboat," Seward ordered at last. "Rig it with poles and lanterns." "And our heading?" Seward tapped his lips. "I shouldn't need to remind you, Captain Seward," Thranik said as he joined them on the quarterdeck, "that it's imperative we reach the port of Dagestan without delay." Seward tapped his lips once more. "Send the longboat aft with a crew of 4 and have them stroke for their lives toward West Bardan. The Daka will think we've seen them and will expect us to head that way, but the storm will maintain its present course. There is to be no light on this ship without my order. I want absolute silence. Do you hear me? Not a sound." "Aye, sir." Seward glanced at Wyatt, who shook his head with a look of disgust. The captain ignored him and turned to his lieutenant. "See to it, Mr. Bishop." "Aye, aye, sir." "You should have tried for the longboat's crew," Wyatt whispered to Hadrian. "We all should have." It was still dark, and the crescent moon had long since fallen into the sea. As per the captain's orders, the ship was quiet. Even the wind had died, and the ship rocked motionless and silent in the darkness. "You don't have a lot of faith in Seward's decision," Hadrian whispered back. "The Daka are smarter than he is. You've got to at least give him the benefit of the doubt. They might think we turned and ran." Wyatt muffled a laugh. "If you were captain and decided to make a run for it against faster ships in the dead of night, would you have left the lanterns burning? The lantern ruse only works if they think we haven't seen them." "I hadn't thought of that," Hadrian admitted. "We'll know soon enough if they took the bait. It's getting lighter." "Where's Royce and his eagle eyes?" Wyatt asked. "He went to sleep after his shift. We've learned over the years to sleep and eat when you can, so you don't regret not doing so later." They peered out across the water as the light increased. "Maybe the captain was right," Hadrian said. "How do you mean?" "I don't see them," Wyatt laughed. "You don't see them because you can't see anything, not even a horizon. There's fog on the water. It happens this time of year." It grew lighter, and Hadrian could see why it was right. A thick gray blanket of clouds surrounded them. Lieutenant Bishop climbed to the quarterdeck and rapped softly on the captain's door. "You asked to be wakened at the first light, sir," he whispered. The captain came out, fully dressed this time, and proudly strode to the bridge. "Fog, sir." The captain scowled at him. "I can see that, Mr. Bishop. I'm not blind." "No, sir." "Send a lad with a glass up to the mainmast." "Mr. Wesley," Bishop called softly. The midshipman came running. "Take this glass to the masthead and report." "Aye, sir." When Captain Seward, rocking on his heels and staring out at the fog, stood with his hand fidgeting behind his back. "It looks promising so far, doesn't it, Mr. Bishop?" "It does indeed, sir. The fog will help hide us all the more." "What do you think now, helmsman?" the captain asked Wyatt. "I think I'll wait for Mr. Wesley's report, if you don't mind, sir." Seward folded his arms in irritation and began to pace, his short legs and plump belly doing little to impart the vision of a commanding figure. Wesley reached the masthead and extended the glass. "Well," Seward called aloud, his impatience getting the better of him. "I can't tell, sir. The fog is too thick. They say the Daka can use magic to raise a fog when they want," Poe whispered to Hadrian as they watched. "They're likely using it to sneak up on us." "Or maybe it's just because the air is cooler this morning," Hadrian replied. Poe shrugged. The crew stood around, silent and idle, for an hour before Mr. Temple ordered Hadrian to serve the morning meal. The men ate, then wandered the deck in silence, like ghosts in a misty world of white. The midday meal came and went as well, with no break in the mist that continued to envelop them. Hadrian had just finished cleaning up when he heard Wesley's voice from the masthead shout, "Sail!" Emerging from the hold, Hadrian felt a cool breeze as the wind moved the fog, parting the hazy white curtains veil after veil. The single word left everyone on edge. "Good Meribah, man!" Seward shouted up. "What kind of sail?" "Red lateen sail, sir." "Damn," Seward cursed. "How many?" "5. 5? 5? How could there be 5? "No, wait," Wesley shouted. 6 to windward and 3 more coming off the port bow." The captain's face drained of color. "Good Meribah." Even as he spoke, Hadrian spotted the sails clustered on the water. "Orders, Captain?" Wyatt asked. Seward glanced around him desperately. "Mr. Bishop, lay the ship on the port tack." Wyatt shook his head defiantly. "We need to grab the wind." "Damn you!" Seward hesitated only a moment, then shouted, "So be it! Hard a port, helmsman! Bring her around! Hard over!" Wyatt spun the wheel, the chains cranking the rudder so that the ship started to turn. Mr. Temple barked orders to the crew. The Emerald Storm was sluggish, stalling in the futile wind. The ship slowed to a mere drift, then the foresail fluttered, billowed, and started to draw, coming around slowly. The yards turned as the men ran aft with the lee braces. The mainsail caught the breeze and blew full. The ship creaked loudly as the masts took up the strain. The storm picked up speed and was halfway round and pointed toward the coast. Still, Wyatt held the wheel hard over. The wind pressed the sails and leaned the ship, tipping the beam dangerously low. Spray broke over the rail as men grabbed hold of whatever they could to remain standing as the deck tilted steadily upward. The captain glared at Wyatt as he grabbed hold of the mizzen shroud, yet he held his tongue. Letting the wind take the ship full on with all sails set, Wyatt pressed the wheel, raising the ship on its edge. Bishop and Temple glanced from Wyatt to the captain and back again, but no one dared give an order in the captain's presence. Hadrian also grabbed hold of a rail to keep from slipping down the deck. Holding tight, he worried that Wyatt might capsize the ship. The hull groaned from the strain, the masts creaked with the pressure, but the ship picked up speed, At first it bucked through the waves, sending bursts of spray over the deck. Then faster it went, until the storm skipped the waves, flying off the crests, with the wind squarely on its aft quarter. The ship made its tight circle, and at last, Wyatt let up, leveling the deck. The ship fell in direct line with the wind, and the bow rose as the storm ran with it. "Trim the sails," the lieutenant ordered. The men set to work once more, periodically glancing astern to watch the approach of the ships. "Mr. Bishop," Seward called, "disperse weapons to the men and issue an extra ration of grog." Royce was on his way aloft, as the larboard crew came off duty. "How long do you think before they catch us?" Looking aft at the tiny armada of red sails chasing their wake. "I don't know. I've never done this before. What do you think?" Royce shrugged. "A few hours, maybe. It's not looking good, is it? And you wanted to be a sailor." Hadrian went about the business of preparing for the evening meal, mindful that it might be the last the men would have. Poe, conspicuously absent, hastily entered the galley. "Where have you been?" Poe looked sheepish. "Talking to Wyatt. Those Daco ships are gaining fast. They'll be on us tonight for sure." Hadrian nodded grimly. Poe moved to help cut the salted pork, then added, "Wyatt has a plan. It won't save everyone, only a handful, really, and it might not work at all. But it's something. He wants to know if you're in." "What about Royce?" "Him too." "What's the plan?" "Sail." They heard Mr. Wesley cry, even from the galley. 2 more tartans dead ahead, when Poe and Hadrian, like everyone else aboard, scrambled to the deck to see Mr. Wesley pointing off the starboard bow. 2 red sails were slipping out from hidden coves along the shore to block their retreat. Sailing nimbly against the wind, they moved to intercept the storm. "Clear the deck for action!" Seward shouted from the quarterdeck, wiping the sweat from his head. Men scrambled across the ship, once more hauling buckets of sand and water. Archers took their positions on the forecastle, stringing their bows. Oil and hot coals were placed at the ready. "We need to steer clear," the captain said. "Helm, bring her." "We need speed, sir," Wyatt interrupted. The captain winced at the interruption. "Be mindful, Demonthal, or I'll skip the flogging I owe you and have you hanged. With all due respect, you abdicated that privilege to the Daco last night. All the sooner if I alter course now." "By Meribah, mister. Temple, take..." The captain stopped as he spotted the tartans beginning to turn. "See? They expected us to break," Wyatt told him. Realizing their mistake, the Daco fought to swing back, but it was too late. A hole had been created. Seward grumbled and scowled at Wyatt. "Sir?" Temple asked. "Never mind. Steady as she goes, Mr. Bishop. Order the archers to take aim at the port side ship. Perhaps we can slow them down if we can manage to set one afire." "Aye, aye, sir." Hadrian rushed to the forecastle. Having proved himself one of the best archers on the ship, he was stationed at the center of the port side. He picked a strong, solid bow and tested the string's strength. "The wind will set the arrows off a bit toward the bow," Poe mentioned, readying a bucket of glowing hot coals. "Might want to lead the target a bit, eh? You're my squire now as well?" Poe smiled and shook his head. "I've seen you in practice. I figure the safest place on this ship right now is here. I'll hand you the oiled arrows. You just keep firing." The Daco tartans slipped through the waves, their red triangular sails billowing out sideways as they struggled on a tight tack to make the best use of the headwind. Dark figures scurried like ants across the decks and rigging of the smaller ships. "Ready arrows!" Lieutenant Bishop shouted. Hadrian fitted his first shaft in the string. As the Dako closed in on the storm, they began to turn. Their yards swept round, and their tillers cranked, pivoting much as Wyatt had. The action all the more impressive as both ships moved in perfect unison, like dancers performing simultaneous pirouettes. "Light arrows!" Hadrian touched the oil-soaked wad at the tip of the shaft to the pot of coals, and it burst into flame. A row of men on the port side stood ready, a trail of soot-black smoke wafting aft. "Take aim," Bishop ordered as the Daka ships came into range. On the deck of the tartans, a line of flaming arrows mirrored their own. "Fire!" Into the blue sky flew a staggered arc of fire, trailing black smoke. At the same time, the Daka launched their volley and the arrows passed each other in mid-air. All around him, Hadrian heard pattering as they struck. The bucket brigade was running to douse the flames, and above them, Royce dropped along a line to kick free one lodged in the masthead before it could ignite the mainsail. Poe had another arrow ready. Hadrian fitted it, lit it with the pot, took aim, and sent it into the lower yard of their mainsail. To his right, he heard the loud thwack of the massive ballista, which sent forth a huge, flaming missile. It struck the side of the tartan, splintering the hull and lodging there. Hadrian heard a hissing fly past his ear. Behind him, the oil bucket splashed and the liquid ignited. Poe jumped back as his trousers flamed. Grabbing a nearby bucket, Hadrian smothered the fire with sand. Another volley rained, peppering the deck. Bosun Bristol, in the process of cranking the ballista for a second shot, fell dead with an arrow in his throat, his hair catching fire. Basil, the officer's cook, took one in the chest, and Seaman Blyden screamed as two arrows hit him, one in the thigh and the other through his hand. Looking up, Hadrian saw this second volley came from the other ship. Shaken, but not seriously harmed, Poe found another oil bucket and brought it to Hadrian. As the two ships came closer, Hadrian found what he was looking for, a bucket at the feet of the archers. Leading his target, he held his breath, took aim, and released. The tartan's bucket exploded. Hadrian spotted a young Daka attempting to douse the flames with water. Instantly, the fire washed the deck. At that moment, the Storm's ballista crew, having loaded the weapon with multiple bolts this time, released a cruel hail on the passing Daka. Screams bridged the gap between the ships as the storm sailed on, leaving the burning ships in its wake. Once more, the crew cheered their victory, but it was hollow. Amid the blackened scorch marks left by scores of arrows, a dozen men lay dead on the deck. They hadn't slipped through the trap unscathed, and the red sails behind them were closer now. When night fell, the captain ordered the off-crew, including Hadrian and Royce, below deck to rest. On the way, they grabbed their old gear from the galley, and the two took the opportunity to change into their cloaks and tunics. Hadrian strapped on his swords. It brought a few curious looks, but no one said a word. Not a single man slept, and few even sat. Most paced, with their heads bowed to avoid the short ceiling. But perhaps this time they were also praying. Many of the crew had appeared superstitious but non-religious until now. "Why don't we put in land?" Seaman Davis asked his fellow soldiers. "The coast's only a few miles off. We could put in and escape into the jungle." "Coral shoals ring the shores of Calais," Banner said, scraping up the surface of the table with a knife. "We'd rip the bottom of the storm a mile out and the Daka would have it. Besides, the captain ain't going to abandon his ship and run. Captain Seward is an arse. Watch your mouth, lad." "Oi, what's he gonna do that can be worse than the Daka?" To that, Banner had no answer. No one did. Fear spread through the crew, fear of certain death, and the poison that comes from waiting idly for it. Hadrian knew from countless battles the folly of leaving men to stagnate with nothing else to occupy their thoughts. The hatch opened and everyone looked up to see Wyatt and Poe. "What's the word?" Davis asked. "It won't be long now, men. Make ready what you need to. The captain will call general quarters soon, I expect." Wyatt paused at the bottom of the ladder and spoke quietly with Grady and Durning. They nodded, then went aft. Wyatt motioned with his eyes for Hadrian and Royce to follow him forward. Only empty hammocks filled the cramped space, leaving them enough privacy to speak. "So what's the plan?" Royce whispered. "We can't win a fight," Wyatt told them. "All we can hope to do is run." "You said the storm can't outrun them," Hadrian reminded him. "I wasn't planning on outrunning them in the storm." Dumb. Hadrian and Royce exchanged glances. "The Daca will want her and the cargo. That's why we made it through the blockade so easily. They were trying to slow us, not stop us. If I had followed Seward's orders, we'd all be dead now. As it is, I only bought us a few hours, but they were needed." "Needed for what, exactly?" Royce asked. "For darkness. The Daca can't see any better at night than we can. And while they take the storm, we'll escape. They'll bring as many of their ships alongside as they can to overwhelm our decks by sheer numbers. When they board us, a party of men I've hand-picked will take one of the tartans. We'll cut the ship free, and with luck, get clear of the storm before they see us. In the darkness and confusion of battle, it might work." They both nodded. Wyatt motioned to Hadrian. "I want you to lead the boarding party. I'll signal you from the quarterdeck." "What are you going to be doing?" Royce asked. "You mean what are we going to be doing? I didn't come all this way not to find Allie. You and I will use the distraction to break into the captain's quarters and steal any orders or parchments we can find. Just watch me. You'll know when." "What about the elves below?" Royce asked. "Don't worry about them. The Daca want the ship intact. In all likelihood, they will treat them better than the new empire has." "Who's in this team of yours?" Hadrian asked. "Poe, of course. Banner, Grady." "All hands on deck," Temple shouted from above as drums thundered. "See you above, gentlemen," Wyatt said while heading for the hold. The sky was black. Invisible clouds covered the stars and shrouded the sliver of moon. Darkness wrapped the sea, a shadowy abyss where only the froth of the bow revealed the presence of water. Behind them, Hadrian saw nothing. "Archers to the aft deck." Hadrian joined the others at the railing, where they lined up shoulder to shoulder, looking out across the emerald storm's wake. "Light arrows," came the order. From across the water they heard a sound, and a moment later men around Hadrian screamed as arrows pelted the stern. "Fire," Bishop ordered. They raised their bows and fired as one, launching their burning shafts blindly into the darkness. A stream of flame flew in a long arch, some arrows dying with a hiss as they fell into the sea, others striking wood, the light outlining a ship about 300 yards behind them. "There," Bishop shouted. "There's your target, men." They exchanged volley after volley. Men fell dead on both ships, thinning the ranks of archers. Small fires broke out on the tartan, illuminating it and its crew. The Daca were short, stocky, and lean, with coarse long beards and wild hair. The firelight cast on them a demonic glow that glistened off their bare, sweat-soaked skin. When the tartan lay less than 50 yards astern, its main mast caught fire and burned like a dead tree. The brilliant light exposed the sea in all directions and stifled the cheers of the storm's crew, when it revealed the positions of the rest of the Dhaka fleet. 4 ships had already slipped alongside them. "Stand by to repel boarders," shouted Seward. He drew his sword and waved it over his head as he ran to the safety of the forecastle walls. "Raise the nets," ordered Bishop. The rigging crew drew up netting on either side of the deck, creating an entangling barrier of rope webbing. Under command of their officers, men took position at the waist deck, cutlasses raised. "Cut the tethers!" Mr. Wesley cried as hooks caught the rail. The deck shook as the tartan slammed against the Emerald Storm's hull. A flood of stocky men, wearing only leather armor and red paint, stormed over the side. They screamed in fury as swords met. "Now!" Hadrian heard Wyatt shout at him. He turned and saw the helmsman pointing to the tartan tethered to the Storm's port side near the stern, the first of the Dhaka's ships to reach them. Most of its crew had already boarded the Storm. Poe, Grady, and others in Wyatt's team held back, watching Hadrian. "Go!" Hadrian shouted, and grabbing hold of the mizzen's port side brace, cut it free and swung out across the gulf, landing on the stern of the tartan. The stunned Dhaka helmsman reached for his short blade as Hadrian cut his throat. 2 more Dhaka rushed him. Hadrian dodged, using the move to hide the thrust. His broadsword drove deep into the first Dhaka's stomach. The second man, seeing his chance, attacked. But Hadrian's bastard sword was in his left hand. With it, he deflected a wild swing, drawing the broadsword from the first Dhaka's stomach. Hadrian brought it across, severing the remaining man's head. With 3 bodies on the aft deck, Hadrian looked up to see Poe and the rest already in possession of the ship and in the process of cutting the tethers free. With the last one cut, Poe used a pole and pushed away from the Storm. "What about Royce and Wyatt?" Hadrian asked, climbing down to the waist deck. "They'll swim for it, and we'll pick them up on the far side," Poe explained as he ran past them, heading aft. "But we need to get into the shadows now." Poe climbed the short steps to the tartan's tiny quarterdeck and took hold of the tiller. "Swing the boom," he shouted in a whisper. "Trim the sails." "We know our jobs a lot better than you, boy," Durning hissed at him. He and Grady were already hauling on the mainsail sheet, trying to tame the canvas that snapped above like a serpent, jangling the rigging rings against the mast. "Banner, Davis, adjust the headsail for a starboard tack." Hadrian had never learned the ropes, and he stood by uselessly while the others raced across the deck. Even if he had picked up anything about rigging, it wouldn't have helped. The Dhaka tartan was quite different in design. Besides being smaller, the hull was sloped like a fishing vessel. But with 2 decks, it had just 2 sails, a head sail supported on a forward tilting mast, and the mainsail. Both were triangular and hung from long curved yards that crossed the mast at angles so that the vessel's profile appeared like the heads of 2 axes cleaving through the air. The deck was dark wood. Glancing around, Hadrian wondered if the Dhaka stained it with the same blood as the sails. After seeing the rigging ornamented with human skulls, it was an easy conclusion to make. On the Storm, the battle was going badly. At least half the crew lay dead or dying. No canvas was visible, as the boarding party had made striking the sails a priority. The deck was awash in stocky, half-naked men who circled the forecastle with torches, dodging arrows as they struggled to breach the bulwark. Poe pushed the tartan's tiller over, pointing the bow away from the Storm. The wind caught the canvas, and the little ship glided gently away. With the sails on the Emerald Storm struck, the ship was dead in the water, and it was easy for them to circle it. Equally small crews remained to operate the other Dhaka boarding ships, but that hardly mattered. as all eyes were on the storm. As far as Hadrian could tell, no one noticed them. "I'm bringing her around," Poe said. "Hadrian, stand by with that rope there, and everyone watch the water for Wyatt and Royce." "Royce?" Durning questioned with distaste. "Why are we picking up the murderer? I can handle the rigging just fine." "Because Wyatt said so," Poe replied. "What if we can't find them? What if they die before they can get off the ship?" Davis asked. "I'll decide that when it happens," Poe replied. You're a barmy boy. I'll be buggered if I'll take orders from a little sod like you. Bloody Davis here's got more years at sea than you, and he's a git if ever there was one. We don't find Demonthal after the first pass. You'll be taking orders from me." "Like I said," Poe repeated, "I'll decide that when it happens." Durning grinned menacingly, but Hadrian did not think Poe, being at the stern, could have seen it in the darkness. Royce wasted no time hitting the deck at the signal. "We haven't got long," Wyatt told him. "The captain's quarters will be our priority." He kicked the door open, shattering the frame. Fully carpeted, the whole rear of the ship was one luxurious suite. Silk patterns and hues of gold and brown covered the walls, with matching upholstered furniture and a silk bed cover. A painting hung on one wall, showing a man bathed in sunlight, his face filled with rapture as a single white feather floated into his upraised hands. Silver lanterns swayed above vast stern windows that banked the far wall. The bed stood to one side with a large desk across from it. Wyatt scanned the room quickly, then moved to the desk. He rifled the drawers. "He'll have put the orders in a safe place." "Like a safe?" Royce asked, pulling a window drape aside to reveal a porthole-sized compartment with a lock. "They always put them behind the drapes." "Can you open it?" Royce smirked. He pulled a tool from his belt, and within seconds, the little door swung open. Wyatt reached inside, grabbed the entire stack of parchments, and stuffed them into a bag. "Let's get out of here," he said, making for the door. "Jump off the starboard side. Poe will pick us up." They came out of the cabin into a world of chaos. Stocky men painted in red poured over the sides of the vessel. Each wielded short, broad blades or axes that cut down everything before them. Only a handful of men stood on the waist deck. The rest had fallen back to the perceived safety of the forecastle. Those who tried to hold their ground died. Roy stepped out onto the deck just in time to see Dime, his topsail captain, nearly cut in half by a cleaving blow from a Dhaka axe. Lieutenant Bishop and the other officers had been slow in reaching the castle. But now, as the Dhaka flooded the deck, they were running full out to reach its walls. Stabbed in the back, Lieutenant Green collapsed. As he fell, he reached out, grabbing at anything. His hands found Midshipman Beryl, running past, and dragged him down as well. Beryl cursed and kicked Green off, but got to his feet too late. The Dhaka circled him. "Help me!" he cried. Royce watched as the crew ignored him and ran on all but one. Midshipman Wesley ran back just in time to stab the nearest Dhaka, caught off guard by the sudden change in his fleeing prey. Wielding his sword with both hands, Wesley sliced horizontally across the chest of the next brute and kicked him aside. "Beryl, this way, run," he shouted. Beryl lashed out at the Dhaka, then ran to Wesley. They were quickly surrounded, and the Dhaka drove them farther and farther away from the forecastle. An arrow from the walls saved Wesley from decapitation as the two struggled to defend themselves. Pushed by the overwhelming numbers, they retreated until their backs hit the rail. A Dhaka blade slashed Beryl's arm and then across his hip. He screamed, dropping his sword. Wesley threw himself between Beryl and his attacker. The young midshipman slashed wildly, struggling to defend the older man. Then Wesley was hit. He stumbled backward and reached out for the netting chains, but missed them and fell overboard. Alone and unarmed, Beryl screamed as the Daka swarmed him until they sent his head from his body. No one noticed Wyatt or Royce creeping in the shadows around the stern, seeking a clear place to jump. They crouched just above the captain's cabin windows. Royce was about to leap when he spotted Thranik stepping out from the hold. The sentinel exited, a torch in hand, as if he merely wondered what all the noise was about. He led the Surrett to the main deck, where they quickly formed a wall around the sentinel. Seeing reinforcements, the Daka rallied to an attack. They charged, only to die upon the Surrett's swords. The Knights of Nephron were neither sailors nor galley slaves. They knew the use of arms and how to hold formation. Gripping his bag to his chest, Wyatt leapt from the ship. "Royce!" Wyatt shouted from the sea below. Royce watched, impressed by the knights' courage and skill as they battled the Daka. It looked as if they might just turn the tide. Then Thranik threw his flaming brand into the ship's hold. A rush of air sounded, as if the ship were inhaling a great breath. A roar followed. A deep, resonating growl shook the timbers beneath Royce's feet. Tongues of flame licked out of every hatch and porthole, the air filling with screams and cries. And in the flickering glow of burning wood and flesh, Royce saw the sentinel smile. Hadrian and the tiny crew of the stolen Daka ship had only just reached the starboard side of the storm when the area grew bright. The Emerald Storm was ablaze. Within little more than a minute, the fire had enveloped the deck. Men in the rigging had no choice but to jump. From that height, their bodies hit the water with a cracking sound. The rigging ignited, ropes snapped, and yards broke free, falling like flaming tree trunks. The darkness of the starless sea fell away as the Emerald Storm became a floating bonfire. Those near the rail leapt into the sea. Screams, cries, and the crackle and hiss of fire filled the night. Looking over the black water whose surface was alive with wild reflections, Hadrian spied a bit of sandy hair and a dark uniform. "Mr. Wesley, grab on," Hadrian called, throwing a rope. Hearing his name, Wesley turned, his face showing the same dazed expression as a man waking from a dream, until he spotted Hadrian reaching out. He took the rope thrown and was reeled in like a fish and hoisted on deck. "Nice to have you aboard, sir," Hadrian told him. Wesley gasped for air and rolled over, vomiting seawater. "From that, I assume you're happy to be here." "Wyatt," Poe shouted. "Royce," Hadrian called. "Over there," Durning said, pointing. Poe turned the tiller, and they sailed towards the sound of splashing. "It's Bernie and Stoll," Grady announced from where he stood on the bow. The two wasted no time scrambling up the ship's ropes. "More splashing over there," Davis pointed. Poe didn't have to alter course as the swimmers made good progress to them. Davis was the first to lend a hand. He reached out to help, and a blade stabbed him in the chest before he was pulled overboard. Hadrian saw them now. Swarthy, painted brutes with long daggers, their wet, glistening skin shimmering with the light of the flames. They grabbed at the netting and scrambled like rats up the side of the tartan. Hadrian drew his sword and lashed out at the nearest one who dodged and stubbornly continued to climb. The Tenkin warrior, Stoll, stabbed another in the face, and the Daka dropped backward with a cry and a splash. Bernie and Wesley joined in, thrashing wildly, until the Daka gave up and fell away into the darkness. "Watch the other side," Wesley shouted. Stoll and Bernie took positions on the starboard rail. but nothing moved. "Any sign of Davis?" Hadrian asked. "The man be dead now," Stahl said. "Be more careful who you sail to, eh?" "Wallard," Bernie said, pointing ahead to more swimmers. "And 3 more over there," Wesley announced, picking out faces in the tumultuous water. "One is Krieg, the carpenter, and that's Dr. Levi. And there is—" Hadrian did not need Royce's eyes to identify the other man. The infernal light coming off the burning ship suited the face. Sentinel Thranik swam toward them, his hood thrown back and his pale face gleaming. Durning, Bernie, and Stoll were bad enough. Now they had Dovin Thranik, of all people. Thranik needed no help as he climbed nimbly up the side of the little ship, his cloak soaked, his face angry. If he were a dog, Hadrian knew he would be growling, and for that, he was pleased. Bullard, the man who had come aboard in the middle of the night, looked even paler than before. The reason became obvious the moment he hit the deck, and blood mingled with seawater. Levi went to him and applied pressure to the wound. "Hadrian! Poe!" Wyatt's voice carried from the sea below. Poe steered toward the sound as the rest stood on their guard. This time, there was no need. Wyatt and Royce were alone, swimming for the boat. "Where were you?" Wyatt asked, climbing aboard. "Sorry, boss, but it's a big ocean." "Not big enough," Durning said, looking over what remained of the storm, his face bright with the glow. "The dark are finally taking notice of us." The mainmast of the Emerald Storm, burning like a tree-sized torch, finally cracked and fell. The forecastle walls blazed. Seward, Bishop, and the rest had either been lost to blades or burned alive. The storm had blackened and cracked, allowing the ship to take on water. The hull listed to one side, sinking from the bow. As it did, the fire was still bright enough to see several of the dark on the nearest vessel pointing in their direction and shouting. "Wheel hard over!" Wyatt shouted, running for the tiller. "Durning, Royce, get aloft. Hadrian, Banner, the mainsail braces. Grady to the headsail braces. Who else do we have here?" Bernie joined Durning and Royce. "Stoll, help with the mainsail. Mr. Wesley, if it wouldn't be too much trouble, perhaps you could assist Grady on the forward braces. Bring her round east-northeast." "That'll put us into the wind again," Grady said, even as Wyatt brought the ship round. "Aye. Starboard tack. With fewer crew and the same ship, we'll be lighter and faster." They got the ship around and caught what wind they could. "Here, Banner, take the tiller," Wyatt said as he scanned the deck. "We can dump some gear and lighten the load further." "Who's that next to you?" Wyatt stopped abruptly when he saw Thranik look up. "What's he doing on board?" Wyatt asked. "Is there a problem, helmsman?" Thranik addressed him. "You fired the ship," Wyatt accused. "Royce told me he saw you throw a torch in the hold. How many oil kegs did you break to get it to go up like that?" "5, I think. Maybe 6. They were elves. They were locked in the hold, trapped down there." "Precisely," Thranik replied. "You bastard!" Wyatt rushed at the sentinel, drawing his cutlass. Thranik moved with surprising speed and dodged Wyatt's attack, throwing his cloak around Wyatt's head and shoving the helmsman to the deck as he drew a long dagger. Hadrian pulled his swords and Stoll immediately moved to intercept him. Poe drew his cutlass, as did Grady, followed quickly by Defoe and Durning. From the rigging above, Royce dropped abruptly into the midst of the conflict, landing squarely between Thranik and Wyatt. The sentinel's eyes locked on him and smoldered. "Mr. Wesley!" Royce shouted, keeping his eyes fixed on Thranik. "What are your orders, sir?" At this, everyone stopped. The ship continued to sail with the wind, but the crew paused. Several glanced at Wesley. The midshipman stood frozen on the deck, watching the events unfold around him. "His orders?" Thrannik mocked. "Captain Seward, Lieutenants Bishop and Green and the other midshipmen are dead," Royce explained. "Mr. Wesley is a senior officer. He is, by rights, in command of this vessel." Thrannik laughed. Wesley began to nod. "He's right." "Shut up, boy," Stoll snapped. "It's time we took care of this business here." Stoll's words brought Wesley around. "I am no boy." Turning to Thrannik, he added, "What I am, sir, is the acting captain of this ship, and as such, you and everyone else," he glanced at Stoll, "will obey my orders." Stoll laughed. "I assure you this is no joke, seaman. I also assure you that I will not hesitate to see you cut down where you stand, and everyone else who fails to obey me." "And how do you plan to do that?" Stoll asked. "This is not the Emerald Storm. You command no one here." "I wouldn't say that." Hadrian flashed his familiar smile at Stoll. "Neither would I," Royce added. "Me neither," Durning joined in, his words quickly echoed by Grady. Wyatt got to his feet slowly. He glared at Thrannik, but said, "Aye, Mr. Wesley is captain now." Poe, Banner, and Krieg acknowledged with a communal eye. What followed was a tense silence. Stoll and Bernie looked at Thrannik, who never took his gaze off Royce. "Very well, Captain," the sentinel said at length. "What are your orders?" "I hereby promote Mr. Dementhal to acting lieutenant. Everyone will follow his instructions to the letter. Mr. Dementhal, you will confine your orders to saving this vessel from the darker and maintaining order and discipline. There are to be no executions and no disciplinary actions of any kind without my authorization. Is that clear?" "Aye, sir." "Petty Officer Blackwater, you're hereby appointed Master-at-Arms. Collect the weapons, but keep them at the ready. See to it Mr. Demanthal's and my orders are carried out. Understood?" "Aye, sir." "Mr. Grady, you are now boatswain. Mr. Levi, please take Mr. Bullard below so that he can be properly cared for. Let me know if there's anything you need. Mr. Durning will be top captain. Seaman Defoe and Melbourne report to him for duties. Mr. Dementhal, carry on. Your sword." Hadrian addressed Stoll. The Tenkin hesitated, but after a nod from Thrannik, handed the blade over. As he did, he laughed and cursed in the Tenkin language. "You'd have found that a bit harder than you think, Hadrian replied to Stoll, and he was rewarded with the Tenkin's shocked expression. Wyatt had everything non-essential and not attached to the ship thrown overboard. Then he ordered silence and whispered the order to change tack. The boom swung over, catching the wind and angling the little ship out to sea. Well behind them, the last light of the Emerald Storm disappeared, swallowed by the waves. Not quite so far away, they could see lanterns bobbing on the following ships. From the shouts, it was clear they were displeased at losing their prize. All eyes faced astern, watching the progression of lanterns as the Daka continued following their previous tack. After a while, two ships altered course, but guessed incorrectly and turned westward. Eventually, all the lanterns disappeared. "Are they gone?" Hadrian heard Hadrian whisper to Wyatt. He shook his head. "They just put out the lanterns. But with luck, they'll think we're running for ground. The nearest friendly port is West Baden, back west." "For a helmsman, you're an excellent commander," the young man observed. "I was a captain once," Wyatt admitted. "I lost my ship." "Really? In whose service?" The Empire or a royal fleet? No service. It was my ship. Wesley looked astonished. You were a pirate? Opportunist, sir. Opportunist. Hadrian awoke to a misty dawn. A steady breeze pushed the tartan through undulating waves. All around them lay a vast and empty sea. They're gone, Wesley said, answering the unasked question. We've lost them. Any idea where we are? About 3 days' sail from Dagestan, Wyatt answered. Dagestan, Grady muttered, looking up. We're not headed there, are we? That was my intention, Wyatt replied. But West Baden is closer. Unfortunately, I confess no knowledge of these coasts, Wesley said. Do you know them well, Mr. de Monthal? Intimately. Good. Then tell us, is Mr. Grady correct? Wyatt nodded. West Baden is closer, but the Dakar know this and will be waiting in that direction. However, since it's impossible for them to be ahead of us, our present course is the safest. Despite our earlier differences, I agree with Mr. de Monthal, Franek offered. As it turns out, Dagestan was the storm's original destination, so we must continue toward it. But Dagestan is much farther away from Avren, Wesley said. The storm's mission was lost with her sinking. I have no way of knowing her original destination even if I did. I have no cargo to deliver. Going farther east only increases our difficulties. I need to be mindful of provisions. But you do have cargo, Franek announced. The storm's orders were to deliver myself, Mr. Bullard, Dr. Levy, Burney, and Stoll to Dagestan. The main cargo is gone, but as an officer of the realm, it's your duty to fulfill what portion you can of Captain Seward's mission. With all due respect, Your Excellency, I have no way to verify what you say. Actually, you do. Wyatt pulled a bent and battered scroll from his bag. These are Captain Seward's orders. Wesley took the damp scroll and asked, But how did you come by this? I knew we'd need charts to sail by. Before I left the storm, I entered the captain's cabin, and being in a bit of a hurry, I just grabbed everything on his desk. Last night I discovered I had more than just charts. Wesley nodded, accepting this, and Hadrian thought, perhaps choosing not to inquire further. He paused a second before reading it. Most men were awake now, and having heard of the conversation, watched Wesley with anticipation. When he finished, he looked over at Wyatt. Was there a letter? Aye, sir, he said, while handing over a sealed bit of parchment. Wesley slipped it carefully into his coat without opening it. We will maintain course to Dagestan. Being bound by imperial naval laws, I must do everything in my power to see that the storm's errand is fulfilled. Chapter 13. The Witch of Melangar. Medina stared out of her window as usual, watching the world with no real interest. It was late and she feared sleep. It always brought the dreams, the nightmares of the past, of her father, and of the dark place. She sat up most nights, studying the shadows and the clouds as they passed over the stars. A line of moonlight crossed the courtyard below. She noted how it climbed the statues on the far gate wall, just like the creeping ivy. Once green, the plant was now a dreary red. It would go dormant, appearing to die, but would still hang on to the wall. It would continue its desperate grip on the stone, even as it withered. For it, at least, there would be a spring. The hammering at her chamber door roused her. She turned, puzzled. No one ever knocked except for Gerald, who always used a light tap. Amelia came and went frequently, but never knocked. Whoever it was, they beat the door with a fury. The pounding landed harder and with such violence that the door latch bounced with a distinct metallic clank as it threatened to break. It never occurred to her to ask, "Who is there?" It never crossed her mind to be fearful. She slid back the bolt, letting the door swing inward. Standing outside was a man she vaguely recognized. His face was flushed, his eyes glassy, and the collar to his shirt lay open. "There you are," he exclaimed. "At long last, I am rewarded with your presence. Permit me to introduce myself again, in case you've forgotten me. I am Archibald Ballantyne, 12th Earl of Chadwick." He bowed low, taking an awkward step when he lost his balance. "May I come in?" The Empress said nothing, and the Earl took this as an invitation, pushing his way into the chamber. He held a finger to his lips. "Shh. We need to be quiet, lest someone discover I'm here." The Earl stood wavering, his glazed eyes canvassing the full length of Medina's small body. His mouth hung partially open, and his head moved up and down as if trying to save his eyes the effort. Medina was dressed only in her thin nightgown, but did not think to cover herself. "You're beautiful. I thought so from the first. I wanted to tell you before this, but they wouldn't let me see you." The Earl pulled a bottle of liquor from his breast pocket and took a swallow. "After all, I'm the hero of your army, and it isn't fair that Ethelred gets to have you. You should be mine. I earned you," the Earl shouted, raising his fist. Pausing, he looked toward the open door. After a moment, he continued, "What has Ethelred ever done? It was my army that saved De Questa and would have crushed Melangar if they had let me. But they didn't want me to. Do you know why? They knew if I took Melangar, then I would be too great to hold back. They're jealous of me, you know? And now Ethelred is planning to take you, but you're mine. Mine, I say." He shouted this last bit, then cringed. Once more, he placed a finger to his lips. "Shh." Meldina watched the Earl with mild curiosity. "How can you want him?" He slammed his fist against his chest. "Am I not handsome? Am I not young?" He twirled around with his arms outstretched until he staggered. He steadied himself on the bedpost. "Ethelred is old, fat, and has pimples. Do you really want that? He doesn't care about you. He's only after the crown." The Earl took a moment to glance around the empty room. "Don't get me wrong," he said in a harsh whisper. He leaned in so close he had to put a hand on her shoulder to steady himself. "I want the crown, too. Anyone saying different is a liar. Who wouldn't want to be emperor of the world? But," he held up a wavering finger, "I would have loved you." He paused, breathing hotly into her face. He licked his lips and caressed her skin through the thin nightgown. His hand left her shoulder and inched up her neck, his open fingers slipping into her hair. "Ethelred will never look at you like this." Archibald took her hand and placed it against his chest. "His heart will never pound like mine, just by being near you. I want power, I want the throne, but I also want you." He looked into her eyes. "I love you, Meldina. I love you, and I want you for my own. You should be my wife." He pulled her to him and kissed her on the mouth, pressing hard, pinching her lips to her teeth. She didn't struggle. She didn't care. He pulled back and searched her face. She didn't respond except to blink. "Meldina?" Emilia called, entering the room. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Valentine said sadly. He looked at Meldina. He searched her face again. Absolutely nothing at all. He turned and left the room. "Are you all right?" Emilia rushed to the Empress, brushing her hair back and looking her over. "Did he hurt you? Am I to marry Regent Ethelred?" Emilia held her breath and bit her lip. "I see. When were you going to tell me?" on my wedding night. I just learned about it recently. You had that incident in the kitchen and I didn't want to upset you. It doesn't upset me, Amelia, and thank you for stopping by. But Amelia hesitated. Is there something else? No. You're different, suddenly. We should talk about this. What is there to talk about? I'll marry Ethelred so he can be emperor. You'll still be empress. Yes. There's no need to worry. I'm fine. You're never fine. No, it must be the good news that I'm to become a bride. Amelia looked terrified. Meldina, what's going on? What's happening in that head of yours? Meldina smiled. It's okay, Amelia. Everything will be fine. Stop using that word. You're really frightening me, Amelia said, reaching toward her. Meldina pulled away, moving to the window. I'm sorry I didn't tell you myself. I'm sorry there was no guard at the door. I'm sorry you had to hear such a thing from the brandy-soaked breath of, It's not your fault, Amelia. It's important to me that you know that. You're all that matters to me. It's amazing how worthless a life feels without someone to care for. My father understood that. At the time I didn't, but now I do. Understand what? Amelia asked, shaking. That living has no value. It's what you do with life that gives it worth. And what are you planning to do with your life, Meldina? Meldina tried to force another smile. She took Amelia's head in her hands and kissed her gently. It's late. Goodbye, Amelia. Amelia's eyes went wide with fear. She began shaking her head faster and faster. No. I'll stay here. I don't want you left alone tonight. As you wish. Amelia looked pleased for a moment. Then fear crept back in. Tomorrow I'll assign a guard to watch you. Of course you will, Meldina replied. True to her word, Amelia remained in Meldina's chamber all night, but slipped out before dawn while the Empress still slept. She went to the office of the Master-at-Arms and burst in on the soldier on duty, unannounced. Why wasn't there a guard outside the Empress's door last night? Where was Gerald? We couldn't spare him, milady. The Imperial Guard is stretched thin. We're searching for the witch, the Princess of Melangar. Regent Salder has commanded me to use every man I have to find her. I don't care. I want Gerald back, watching her door. Do you understand? But, milady... Last night, the Earl of Chadwick forced his way into the Empress's room. In her room. Has it occurred to you, to anyone, that a witch might be coming to kill the Empress? A long pause. I didn't think so. Now get Gerald back on his post at once. Leaving the Master-at-Arms, Amelia roused Meldina's chambermaid from her bunk in the dormitory. After the girl had dressed, she hurried her along to Meldina's room. Anna, I want you to stay with the Empress and watch her. Watch her? What for? I mean, what should I be watching for, milady? Just make certain the Empress doesn't hurt herself. How do you mean? Just keep an eye on her. If she does anything odd or unusual, send for me at once. Medina heard Anna enter the room quietly. She continued pretending to sleep. Near dawn, she stretched, yawned, and walked over to the wash basin to splash water on her face. Anna was quick to hand her a towel and grinned broadly to have been of assistance. Anna, is it? Medina asked. The girl's face flushed, and her eyes lit up with joy. She nodded repeatedly. Anna, I'm starved. Would you please run to the kitchen and see if they can prepare me an early breakfast? Be a dear and bring it up when it's ready. Medina put on a pout and turned her eyes downward. I am sorry. I apologize for asking so much of you. Oh no. Your gloriousness, I'll get it at once. Thank you. You're most welcome, your worship. Medina wondered if she kept her longer how many elaborate forms of address she might come up with. As soon as Anna left the room, Medina walked to the door, closed it, and slid the deadbolt. She walked towards the tall mirror that hung on the wall, picking up the pitcher from the water basin as she passed. Without hesitation, she struck the mirror, shattering both. She picked up a long shard of glass and went to her window. "Your Eminence?" Gerald called from the other side of the door. "Are you all right?" Outside, the sun was just coming up. The autumn morning light angled in sharp, slanted shafts across the courtyard below. She loved the sun and thought its light and warmth would be the only thing besides Amelia that she would miss. She wrapped her gown around the end of the long, jagged piece of glass. It felt cold. Everything felt cold to her. She looked down at the courtyard and breathed in a long breath of air, scented with the dying autumn leaves. The guard continued to bang on the door. "Your Eminence?" he repeated. "Are you all right?" "Yes, Gerald," she said. "I'm fine." Arista entered the palace courtyard, walking past the gate guards, hoping they could not hear the pounding of her heart. This must be how Royce and Hadrian feel all the time. I'm surprised they don't drink more. She shook from both fear and the early morning chill. Ezra Hardin's robe had been lost the night of Hilfred's rescue, leaving her with only Lynette's kirtle. Hilfred. He'll be furious when he reads the note. It hurt her heart just to think of him. He had stood in her shadow for years, serving her whims, taking her abuse, trapped in a prison of feelings he could never reveal. Twice he had nearly died for her. He was a good man, a great man. She wanted to make him happy. He deserved to be happy. She wanted to give him what he never thought possible, to fix what she had broken. For 3 nights they had hid together, and every day Hilfred had tried to convince her to return to Melangar. At last, she had agreed, telling him they would leave the next day. Arista had slipped out when Hilfred went to get supplies. If all went well, she would be back before he returned, and they could leave as planned. If not, if something happened, the note would explain. It had occurred to her only the night before that she had never cast the location spell in the courtyard. From there, the smoke would certainly locate the wing, and if lucky enough, she might even pinpoint Gaunt's window. The information would be invaluable to Royce and Hadrian, and could mean the difference between a rescue and a suicide mission. And as much as she did not want to admit it, she owed Ezra Hardin as well. If doing this small thing could save Deacon Gaunt, a good man wrongly imprisoned, ease the wizard's passing, and vanquish her guilt, it would be worth the risk. The gate guards paid little attention when she had entered. She took this as a good sign that no one had connected Ella, the scrub girl, to the Witch of Melangar. All she needed to do now was cast the spell and walk out again. She crossed the inner ward to the vegetable garden. The harvest had come and gone. The plants were cleared, and the soil had been turned to await the spring. The soft earth would allow her to draw the circle and symbols required. She clutched a pouch of hair still in the pocket of her kirtle as she glanced around. Nothing looked amiss. The few guards on duty ignored her. As casually as she could, she began drawing a circle by dragging her foot in the dirt. When she had finished, she moved on to the more tedious task of the runes, which was more time-consuming to do with her toe than with her hand and a bit of chalk. All the while, she worried that her drawing would be obvious from any number of upper-story windows. She was just finishing the second-to-last rune when a guard exited the palace and walked toward her. Immediately, she crouched, pretending to dig. If he questioned her, she could say that Iba sent her to look for potatoes. or that she thought she might have dropped the pantry key when she was in the courtyard. She hoped he would just walk by. She needed to be the invisible servant this one last time. It quickly became apparent that he was specifically coming for her. As he closed the distance, her only thought was of Hilfred and how she wished she had kissed him goodbye. Amelia was in her office, quickly going over instructions with Nimbus. They had ticked off only a few items for the wedding preparations. If she could give him enough to keep busy, she could return to Medina. The urgency pulled at her every minute she was away. "If you get done with that, then come see me, and I'll give you more to do," she told him curtly. "I have to get back to the Empress. I think she might do something stupid." Nimbus looked up. "The Empress is a bit eccentric, certainly. But if I may, she has never struck me as stupid, my lady." Amelia narrowed her eyes at him suspiciously. Nimbus had been a good and faithful servant, but she did not like the sound of that. "You notice too much, I think, Nimbus. That's not such a good trait when working in the Imperial Palace. Ignorance is perhaps a better choice for survival." "I'm just trying to cheer you up," he replied, sounding a little hurt. Amelia frowned and collapsed in her chair. "I'm sorry. I'm starting to sound a bit like Solder, aren't I?" "You still have to work on making your veiled threats sound more ominous. A deeper voice would help. Or perhaps toying with a dagger, or swishing a glass of wine as you say it." "I wasn't threatening you, I was..." He cut her off. "I'm just joking, my lady." Amelia scowled, then pulled the parchment off her desk, crumpled it into a ball and threw it at him. "Honestly, I don't know why I hired you. Not for my comedy, I sense." Amelia gathered a pile of parchments, a quill, and a bottle of ink, and headed for the door. "I'm going to be working from Medina's room today. Look there if you need me." "Of course," he said as she left. Not far down the hall, Amelia saw Anna walking by with a tray of food. "Anna," she called, rushing toward her. "I told you to stay with the Empress." "Yes, my lady, but what?" "The Empress asked me to fetch her some breakfast." A cold chill shot up Amelia's spine. The Empress had asked her? "Has the Empress ever spoken to you before?" On the verge of tears, Anna shook her head. "No, my lady. I was very honored. She even knew my name." Amelia raced for the stairs, her heart pounding. Reaching the top and nearing the bedchamber, she feared what she would find. Nimbus was right, perhaps more than he knew. Medina was not stupid, and Amelia's mind filled with the many terrible possibilities. Arriving at the door, she pushed Gerald aside and burst into the Empress's room. She steeled herself, but what she saw was beyond her wildest imaginings. Medina and Ella sat together on the Empress's bed, hand in hand, chatting. Amelia stood still, shocked. Both glanced up as she entered. Ella's face was fearful, but Medina's expression was calm as usual, as if expecting her. "Ella?" Amelia exclaimed. "What are you doing?" "Gerald," Medina interrupted. "From now on, no one, and I mean no one, is to enter without my say-so. Understood?" "Of course, Your Eminence." Gerald looked down guiltily. Medina waved a hand. "It's not your fault. I didn't tell you. Now please close the door." He bowed and drew the door shut. Amelia, meanwhile, stood silent. Her mouth was agape, but no words came out. "Sit down before you fall down, Amelia. I want to introduce you to a friend of mine. This is Arista, the Princess of Melangar." Amelia tried to make sense out of the senselessness. "No, Medina. This is Ella, a scrub girl." "What's going on?" Amelia asked desperately. I thought you might be..." Her eyes went to the broken picture and shards of mirrored glass scattered across the corner of the room. "I know what you thought," the Empress said, looking towards the window. That's another reason you should be welcoming Arista. If I hadn't seen her in the courtyard and realized... Well, anyway, I want you two to be friends. Emilia's mind was still whirling. Medina appeared more lucid than ever, yet she made no sense. Maybe she only sounded rational. Maybe the Empress had cracked altogether. At any moment she might introduce Red, the elk hound from the kitchen, as the ambassador of Langstair. Medina, I know you think this girl is a princess, but just a week ago you also thought you were dead and buried. Remember? Are you saying you think I'm crazy? No, I just... Lady Emilia, Ella spoke for the first time. My name is Arista Ascendan, and I am the Princess of Melan Gar. Your Empress isn't crazy. She and I are old friends. Emilia stood staring at the two of them, confused. Were they both insane? How could... Oh, sweet Mirabelle. It's her. The long fingernails, the way she met Emilia's stare, the bold inquiries about the Empress. Ella was the witch of Melan Gar. Get away from her, Emilia yelled. Emilia, calm down. She's been posing as a maid to get to you. Arista's not here to harm me. You're not, are you? She asked Ella, who shook her head. There, you see? Now come here and join us. We have much to do. Thrace. Ella spoke, looking nervously at Medina. The Empress raised a hand to stop her. The both of you need to trust me, Medina said. Emilia shook her head. But how can I? Why should I? This woman... Because, the Empress interrupted, we have to help Arista. Emilia would have laughed at the absurdity if Medina had not looked so serious. In all the times she had taken care of her, Emilia had never seen her so focused, so clear-eyed. She felt out of her element. The hazy Medina was gone, but she was still speaking nonsense. She had to make her understand, for her own good. Medina, guards are looking for this woman. They've been combing the city for days. That's why she's going to stay here. It's the safest place. Not even the regents will look for her in my bedroom, and it'll make helping her that much easier. Helping her? Helping her with what? Emilia was nearly at the end of her own sanity, just trying to follow this absurd conversation. We're going to help her find Deegan God, the true heir of Novron. Chapter 14, Calais. The port of Dogaston surprised first-time visitors from Avren, who thought of everywhere else as less civilized or uncultured. Calais was generally held by those who had never been there to be a crude, ramshackle collection of tribal bands, living in mud or wooden huts with a dense and mysterious jungle. It shocked most when they first laid eyes on the massive domes and elegant spires rising across the coast. The city was astonishingly large and well-developed. Stone and gray brick buildings sat densely packed on a graduated hillside, rising from the elegant harbor that put Equesta's wooden docks to shame. Here, 4 long stone piers stretched into the bay, along which stately towers rose at regular intervals, facilitating the needs of the bustling trade center. Masts of more than 100 ships, nearly all of them exotic merchant vessels, lined the harbor. Hadrian remembered the city the moment it came into view. The heat of the ancient stones, the spice-scented streets, the exotic women, all memories of an impetuous youth that he preferred to forget. He had left the East behind without regret, and it was not without reservations that he found himself returning. No bells rang in the towers along the harbor as they entered. No alarms signaled as the blood-red sails of their darker-built tartan entered the port. A pilot boat merely issued out and hailed with them at their approach. Foreign language, the pilot called to them. "I can't understand you," Wesley replied. "What's name of your vessel? And name of captain?" the pilot repeated. Oh, it doesn't have a name, I'm afraid. But my name is Wesley Belstrade. The pilot jotted something on a handheld tablet, frowning. Where are you outing from? We are the remaining crew of the Emerald Storm, Her Imperial Eminence's vessel, out from the capital city of Equista. What your business and how long staying will you be? We are making a delivery. I am not certain how long it will take. The pilot finished asking questions and indicated they should follow him to a berth. Another official was waiting on the dock and asked Wesley to sign several forms before he would allow anyone to set foot on land. According to Seward's orders, we're to contact a Mr. Dillidrum. I will go ashore and try to locate him. Wesley announced. Mr. Demuthol, you and Seaman Stoll will accompany me. Seaman Blackwater, you will be in charge here until my return. See to it that the stores are secured and the ship buttoned down. Aye, sir. Hadrian saluted. The three disembarked and disappeared into the maze of streets. Wonderful luck we've had in picking up survivors, eh? Hadrian mentioned to Royce as he met his partner on the raised aft deck of the ship. The others remained at the waist or the bow, staring in fascination at the port around them. There was a lot to take in. Unusual sounds drifted from the urban landscape. The jangle of bells, the ringing of a gong, shouts of merchants in a strange musical language, and above it all, the haunting voice of a man singing in the distance. Dockworkers moved cargo to and from ships. Most were dressed in robes with vertical stripes, their skin a tawny brown, their faces bearded. Bolts of shimmering silk and sheer cloth waited to be loaded, as did urns of incense and pots of fragrant oil, whose scents drifted on the harbor breeze. The stone masonry of the buildings was impressive. Intricate designs of flowers and geometric shapes adorned nearly all the constructions. Domes were the most common architectural style, some inlaid with gold, others in silver or in colorful tiles. The larger buildings displayed multiple domes, each featuring a central spire pointing skyward. For the first time in 3 days, they'd found an opportunity to speak alone. I thought you showed great restraint, and I was impressed with your diplomatic solution to our little civil war, Hadrian told Royce. I'm just watching your back, like Gwen asked. Royce took a seat on a thick pile of netted ropes. It was a stroke of brilliance appointing Wesley, Hadrian remarked. Wish I had thought of it. I liked that boy. Did you see the way he picked Stoll and Wyatt to go with him? Wyatt knows the docks, and Stoll knows the language and possibly the city. Perfectly sensible choices, but they're also the two who would make the most trouble out of his sight. He's a lot more like his brother than he thinks. It's a shame they were born in Chadwick. Valentine doesn't deserve them. It's not looking good. You know that, right? Royce asked. What with the weapons and Marek's payment going down with the storm and everyone in charge now dead, I don't see where we go from here. Hadrian took a seat on the railing beside Royce. Water lapped against the wooden hull of the tartan and seagulls cried overhead. But we still have Marek's orders and that letter. What did it say? I didn't read it. Weren't you the one who called me stupid because... I never had a chance. Wyatt grabbed them first. Then there was this little incident with a burning ship and lots of swimming. Now Wesley has them and he's hardly slept. I've not had an opportunity. Then we'll have to stick to that letter until either you get a chance to take a peek or we solve this riddle. I mean, what is the Empire doing sending weapons to Kale when they need them to fight the nationalists? Maybe bribing Kale to join the fight on their side? Hadrian shook his head. Renard could beat them in a war all by itself. There's no organization down here, no central authority, just a bunch of competing warlords. The whole place is corrupt, and they constantly fight each other. There's no way Marek could convince enough leaders to go fight for the new empire. Most of these warlords have never even heard of Avran, and what's with the elves? What were they doing with them? I have to admit, I'd like to know that myself, Royce said. Hadrian's glance followed Thranik as he came topside and lay among the excess canvas at the bow, his hood pulled down to block the light, his arms folded across his chest. He almost looked like a corpse in need of a coffin. Hadrian gestured toward the sentinel. So what's going on between you and Thranik, anyway? He appears to really hate you, even more than most people. Royce didn't look in his direction. He sat nonchalantly, pretending to ignore the world, as if they were the only two aboard. Funny thing that. I never met him, never heard of him until this voyage, and yet I know him rather well, and he knows me. Thank you, Mr. Ezra Harden. Can you provide me with perhaps a more cryptic answer? Royce smiled. I see why he does it now. It's rather fun. I'm also surprised you haven't figured it out yet. Figured what out? Our boy, Thranik, has a nasty little secret. It's what makes him so unpleasant, and at the same time, so dangerous. He would have killed Wyatt, might even have given you a surprise or two. With Stoll added to the mix and Barney slinking about, it wasn't a battle I felt confident in winning, even if I didn't have Gwen's voice echoing in my head. You aren't going to tell me, are you? What would be the fun in that? This will give you something to do. You can try to guess, and I can amuse myself by insulting your intelligence. I wouldn't take too long, though. Thranik is going to die soon. Wesley returned and trotted up the gangway to address them. I want volunteers to accompany me. Sentinel Thranik, Mr. Bullard, Dr. Levy, and Seaman Stoll and Defoe inland. We will be traveling deep into the Kalayan jungles. The journey will not be without significant risk, so I won't order anyone to follow me who doesn't want to go. Those who choose to stay behind will remain with the ship. Upon my return, we will sail for home, where you will receive your pay. Where in the jungle are you headed, Mr. Wesley? Banner asked. I must deliver a letter to Randon Gill, who I'm informed is a warlord of some note in these parts. I have met with Mr. Dilladrum, who has been awaiting our arrival and has a caravan prepared and ready to escort us. Gill's fortress, however, is deep in the jungles, and contact with the Baran Gazelle is likely. Now, who is with me? Hadrian, who was one of the first to raise his hand, found it strange that he was among the majority. Wyatt and Poe did not surprise him, but even Jacob and Grady joined in after seeing the others. Only Greg and Banner abstained. I see, Wesley said with a note of surprise. All right then, Banner. I'll leave you in charge of the ship. What are we going to do while you're gone, sir? Banner asked. Nothing, he told them. Just stay with the ship and out of the city. Don't cause any trouble. Banner smiled gleefully at Greg. So we can just sleep all day if we want? I don't care what you do, as long as you protect the ship and don't embarrass the Empire. Both of them could hardly contain their delight. I'll bet the rest of you are wishing you hadn't raised your hands now. You realize there's only about a week's worth of rations below, right? Wyatt mentioned. You might want to eat sparingly. A worried look crossed Banner's face. You're gonna hurry back, right? Wesley led them off the ship and into the city, setting a brisk pace and keeping a sharp eye on the line of men. The old man, Anson Ballard, was the only straggler, but this had more to do with his age than his wounds, which had turned out to be only superficial cuts. Loud-colored tents and awnings lined the roads of Dowgaston, from the harbor to the square. Throngs filled the paved pathways as merchants shouted to the crowds, waving banners with unrecognizable symbols. Old men smoked pipes beneath the shelter of striped canopies as scantily dressed women with veiled faces stood provocatively on raised platforms, gyrating slowly to the beat of a dozen drummers, bell ringers, and cymbal players. There was too much happening to focus on any single thing. Everywhere one looked, there were dazzling colors, tantalizing movements, intoxicating scents, and exciting music. Overwhelmed, the little parade of sailors marched in step with Mr. Wesley as he led them to their promised guide. He and his team were waiting along a paved avenue not far from the city's grand bazaar. Dildrum looked like an overweight beggar. His coat and dark breeches were faded and poorly patched. Long dirty hair burst out from under a formless felt hat, as if in protest. His beard, equally mismanaged, showed bits of grass nestled in its snarls. His face was dusky and his teeth yellow, but his eyes sparkled in the afternoon sun. He stood on the roadside before a train of curious beasts. They appeared to be shrunken, shaggy horses. The animals were loaded with bundles and linked together by leads from one to the next. 6 short, half-naked men helped Dildrum keep the train under control. They wore only breechcloths of loose linen and clattering necklaces of colored stones. Like Dildrum, they grinned brightly at the sailors' approach. "Welcome, welcome, gentlemen," he warmly addressed them. "I am Dildrum, your guide. Before we leave our fair city, perhaps you would like some time to peruse our fine shops. As per previous arrangements, I and my Vintu friends will be providing you with food, water, and shelter. But we'll be many days afield, and as such, some comforts as could be obtained in the bazaar might help make your trek more pleasant. Consider our fine wines, liquors, or perhaps an attractive slave girl to make the camps more enjoyable." A few eyes turned appraisingly toward the shops, where dozens of colorful signboards advertised in a foreign tongue. Music played, strange twanging strings and warbling pipes. Hadrian could smell lamb spiced with curry, a popular dish as he recalled. "We will leave immediately," Wesley replied, louder than was necessary for merely Dildrum to hear him. "Suit yourself, good sir." The guide shrugged sadly. He made a gesture to his Vintu workers, and the little men used long switches and yelping cries to urge the animals of the caravan forward. As they did, one spotted Hadrian and paused in his work. His brows furrowed as he stared intently until a shout from Dildrum sent him back to herding. "What was that all about?" Royce asked. Hadrian shrugged, but Royce looked unconvinced. "You were here for, what, 5 years? Anything happen? Anything you want to share?" "Sure," he replied with a sarcastic grin. "Right after you fill me in on how you escaped from Manson prison and why you never killed Ambrose Moore." "Sorry I asked." "I was young and stupid," Hadrian offered. "But I can tell you that Wesley is right about the jungle being dangerous. We want to watch ourselves around Gil." "You met him?" Hadrian nodded. "I've met most of the warlords of the Gurum, but I'm sure everyone's forgotten me by now." As if overhearing, the train worker glanced over his shoulder at Hadrian once more. "Everywhere, landward from Daugaston is uphill," Dildrum was saying as the troop walked along the narrow dirt path through farmlands dotted by domed grass huts. "That is the way of the world everywhere, is it not? From the sea, we always need to go up. It makes the leaving that much harder, but the returning that much more welcome." They walked 2 abreast, with Wesley and Dildrum, Wyatt and Poe, Royce and Hadrian in front, while Thronic's group followed behind the Vintu and the beasts. Having Thronic and his crew behind them was disconcerting, but it was better than walking with them. Dildrum set a brisk pace for a portly little man. stepping lively and thrusting his bleached walking stick out with practiced skill. He bent the brim down on his otherwise shapeless hat to block the sun, making him look comical, even while Hadrian wished he had a silly-looking hat of his own. "Mr. Dilladrum, what exactly are your instructions concerning us?" Wesley inquired. "I am contracted to safely deliver officers, cargo, and crew of the Emerald Storm to the Palace of the Four Winds in Dur-Garon." "Is that the residence of Randon-Gil?" "Ah, yes, the fortress of the Panther of Dur-Garon." "Panther?" Wyatt asked. Dildrum chuckled. "It's what the Vintu call the Warlord. They're a very simple folk, but very hard workers, as you can see. The Panther is a legend among them." "A hero," Wesley offered. "A panther is not a hero to anyone. A panther is a great cat that hides himself in the jungle. He's a ghost to those who seek him, deadly to those he hunts, but to those he doesn't, he's merely a creature deserving of respect. The panther does not concern himself with the Vintu, but stories of his valor, cruelty, and cunning reach them." "You are not Vintu?" "No, I'm Erbonese. Erbon is a region to the northwest, not far from Mandolin." "And the Tenkin?" Wesley asked. "Is the Warlord one of them?" Dilladrum's expression turned dark. Yes, the Tenkin are everywhere in these jungles." He pointed to the horizon ahead of them. "Some tribes are more welcoming than others. Not to worry, my Vintu and I know a good route. We'll pass through one Tenkin village, but they're friendly and familiar to us. Like the one you call Stahl, yes? We'll make it safely." As they climbed higher, they entered a great plain of tall grass that swayed enchantingly in the breeze. Climbing a large rock, they could see for miles in all directions, except ahead, where a tall, forested ridge rose several hundred feet. They made camp just before sundown. Hardly a word passed between Dilladrum and the Vintu. But they immediately went to work setting up decorative tents with embroidered geometric designs and neatly bordered canopies. Cots and small stools were put out for each, along with sheets and pillows. Cooked in large pots over an open fire, the evening meal was strong and spicy enough to make Hadrian's eyes water. He found it tasty and satisfying after weeks of eating the same tired pork stew. The Vintu took turns entertaining. Some played string instruments, similar to a lute. Others danced, and a few sang lilting ballads. The words Hadrian couldn't understand, but the melody was beautiful. Animal calls filled the night. Screeches, cries, and growls threatened in the darkness, always too loud and too close. On their third day out, the landscape began to change. The level plains tilted upward, and trees appeared more frequently. The forests that had lined the distance were upon them, and soon they were trudging under a canopy of tall trees whose massive roots spread out across the forest floor like the fingers of old men. At first, it was good to be out of the sun, but then the path became rocky, steep, and hard to navigate. It didn't last long, as they soon crested a ridge and began a sharp descent. On the far side of the ridge, they could see a distinct change in the flora. The undergrowth thickened, turning a deeper green. Larger leaves, vines, thickets of creepers, and needle-shaped blades encroached on the track, causing the Vintu to occasionally move ahead and chop a path. The next day it began to rain, and while at times it poured and at others it only misted, it never ceased. "They always seem content, don't they?" Hadrian mentioned to Royce as they sat under the canopy of their tent, watching the Vintu preparing the evening meal. It could be blazingly hot or raining like now, and they don't seem to care one way or the other. "Are you now saying we should become Vintu?" Royce asked. I don't think you can just apply for membership into their tribe. I think you need to be born into it. What's that? Wyatt asked. Coming out of the tent, the three shared, wiping his freshly shaved face with a cloth. Just thinking about the Vintu and living a simple existence of quiet pleasures, Hadrian explained. What makes you think they're content? Royce asked. I found that when people smile all the time, they're hiding something. These Vintu are probably miserable, economically forced into relative slavery, catering to wealthy foreigners. I'm sure they would smile just as much while slitting our throats to save themselves another day of hauling Dilladrum's packs. I think you've been away from Gwen too long. You're starting to sound like the old Royce again. Across the camp they spotted Stahl, Thranich, and Dafo. Stahl waved in their direction and grinned. See, big grin, Royce mentioned. Fun group, eh? Hadrian muttered. Yeah, they're a group, aren't they? Royce nodded thoughtfully. Why would a sentinel, a Tenkin warrior, a physician, a thief, and whatever the heck Bollard is, go into the jungles of Cali to visit a Tenkin war lord? And what's Bollard's deal? Wyatt and Hadrian shrugged in unison. Isn't that a bit odd? We were all on the same ship together for weeks, and we don't know anything about the man beyond the fact that he doesn't look like he's seen the sun in a decade. Perhaps if we found out, it would provide the common connection between the others and this Erendombon fellow.